Whispers of the Ganges in the Buddha's time, listen closely. Before the night grows deep, the river Ganges is already moving through the darkness like a breathing memory, carrying the footsteps, prayers, and quiet sorrows of an ancient world. We begin in northern India during the lifetime of the Buddha, where riverbanks hold farmers, merchants, seekers, mothers, monks, and kings within the same vast current of change. Along these waters, people come with clay lamps, bundles of grain, aching bodies, whispered hopes, and questions too heavy to speak aloud. They believe the river can cleanse, bless, nourish, and bear away what the heart can no longer carry. Yet in the same age, walking the dusty roads not far from these banks, the Buddha teaches of another kind of release, one no current can deliver to the skin, because it must be awakened within. So let the day soften now. Let the last warmth of evening fade from the open plain. Let the world grow quieter around you as the old river widens in the mind, deep and darkening, its surface turning from gold to bronze, from bronze to shadow. There is a hush that comes at this hour, just before night fully settles, when birds draw low over the reeds, when cattle are led home in slow lines through the dust, when cooking fires begin to glow in village courtyards, and when the sky above the northern plains seems large enough to hold every grief and every prayer of the living, the Ganges flows through it all. In the Buddha's time, this river is not just water crossing the land. It is road, boundary, witness, and rumor. It gathers streams from distant places and carries them past fields of barley and rice, past ferry crossings and market towns, past forests where hermits sit beneath sal and banyan trees, past shrines darkened by oil smoke, past embankments where children play, until they are called indoors by the evening voice of a parent. Long before any single traveler reaches its shore, the river has already touched countless lives upstream. It arrives heavy with silt, with memory, with stories no hand could ever gather in full. If you were standing there at dusk, the air would still hold the warmth of the sun-baked earth, but coolness would be beginning to rise from the water. You might smell wet clay, trampled grass, smoke from dung fires, sesame oil, river reeds, and the faint sweetness of flowering trees somewhere beyond the village path. You would hear oars knocking softly against wood, the murmur of people finishing the day's trade, a dog barking in the distance, the rustle of palm leaves, and, underneath it all, the patient sound of water meeting. Sure, again and again, never urgently, never still, this is the world into which our story opens. The middle lands of ancient northern India, fertile and busy, sacred and ordinary at once. Kingdoms rise and bargain. Caravans move between cities. Roads are worn into the soil by merchants' carts, pilgrims' feet, royal messengers, and barefoot wanderers who have left home in search of truth. In the cool months, the air may turn gentle and clear. In the hot months, dust and heat lie over the plains, and with the rains, the river swells, changing paths, flooding banks, renewing the ground, reminding everyone who depends on it that life is given and taken in cycles larger than any household can command. Along the Ganges, no one lives entirely apart from change. A ferryman watches the sky and knows by color what kind of dawn will come. A farmer studies the edge of the water and reads in it the fate of next season's crop. A merchant counts on river routes to move cloth, salt, grain, copper, fine wood, and news from one settlement to another. A mother brings her child to bathe, touching the small warm back with tender hands, hoping health and blessing might cling there. A grieving family lets ashes go upon the current, trusting that what is carried away may also be held. A Brahmin chants near the bank, preserving rituals older than memory. A wandering ascetic drinks from a cupped hand and stares into the stream as if it might answer him. A monk in ochre robes pauses beneath gathering evening, his bowl empty or half filled, his gaze lowered, his mind trained toward a peace deeper than ritual. And over all of them, the river remains what it has always been, moving, receiving, reflecting, never keeping the same shape for long. There is something tender in the way human beings turn toward water when they are tired. We come to it with thirst, with heat in the body, with dust on the feet, with burdens tucked quietly under the ribs. In the age of the Buddha, many believed that holy rivers possessed a purifying power beyond the visible. To step into sacred water was not merely to cool the skin. It was to hope that guilt, misfortune, sorrow, or spiritual stain might dissolve into the current and be taken somewhere far beyond the reach of memory. At dusk and dawn, at festival times and private moments of need, people descended the ghats and muddy banks seeking relief that felt close enough to touch. And who could blame them? Water soothes, water carries, water gives the illusion, and perhaps the mercy, of beginning again. Yet the Buddha, living and teaching in this same world, looked with unusual gentleness upon that longing. He did not mock the human wish to be cleansed. He understood suffering too well for that, but again and again, his words pointed beyond outward washing. If anger still burned in the heart, if craving still tightened its grip, if ignorance still clouded the mind, then even the holiest river could not set a person free in the deepest sense. Purity, in his teaching, was not painted onto the body by contact with sacred things. It was cultivated through seeing clearly, acting compassionately, and loosening the inner knots that bind one life to sorrow. So here, at the edge of night, two truths stand beside each other like reflections on the same dark water. One truth belongs to the hands, the feet, the skin, the customs of generations. Come to the river, bathe, offer, pray, release, remember. The other belongs to the inward path. No current can wash away greed, hatred, or delusion for you. No outward rite can replace the difficult, luminous work of awakening. Between these truths lies the tender human world we will enter tonight, not as judges, but as listeners, because this is not only a story about ideas, it is a story about lives. It is about the ferryman whose labor begins before sunrise and ends after moonrise, when the last traveler has crossed. It is about women who come balancing pots on their hips, speaking softly with one another at the water's edge. It is about noble households whose shaded compounds seem secure, yet cannot keep old age, fear, or loss from entering. It is about traders who arrive with strong animals jingling harness and the smell of far roads on their cloaks. It is about children laughing near the bank, unaware of doctrine, fully alive to mud, fish, and evening light. It is about ascetics who have given up comfort but not yet found peace. It is about monks who walk silently from village to village, carrying almost nothing, but learning to meet the whole world with a less burdened heart. And, too, it is about those who are never named in chronicles. The old woman rinsing lentils in a shallow basket while her knees ache in the fading light. The boy entrusted to hold the rope of a restless goat. The widow who says little, but watches the water every evening as if someone might return upon it. The laborer on coiled rope beside moored boats. The servant girl sent down to fill jars before the night insects thicken around the bank. The father who has enough grain this season and fears the next one anyway. The young seeker who has heard of a sage called the Buddha and wonders if leaving home would be courage or cruelty. Each life is small against the width of the river, and yet each is immense within itself. The Ganges receives them all without preference. This is part of its mystery. The river does not ask who is noble and who is poor, who is wise and who is confused, who comes to praise, who comes to weep, who comes to bargain, who comes because there is nowhere else to go. It takes the ferry boat and the funeral ash, the lotus stem and the broken branch, the lamp set afloat in hope, and the muddy footprint washed away by mourning. In this way, it becomes more than a setting. It becomes a witness, silent and enduring, present for all the ways people try to live with uncertainty. And uncertainty is everywhere in the Buddha's time, just as it is in ours. Harvests may fail, children may fall ill, kings may quarrel, desire may bloom where duty forbids it, Love may be returned or not. Bodies grow tired. Parents die, friends depart, wealth arrives and vanishes. The face in the polished metal mirror changes year by year. Villages expand, then thin. Forests are cut back. Rains come late. A thought enters the mind and troubles sleep. Another thought opens into compassion. Human life, whether wrapped in coarse cloth or fine linen, trembles under the same law of impermanence. Perhaps that is why the river feels sacred to so many. It is always changing, and yet always itself. It reminds those who stand beside it that continuity and change are not enemies. The water before your eyes is not the water that passed an hour ago. The dusk reflected there is already becoming night. The child lifted into the river by a laughing mother will one day return as an adult, carrying grief, responsibility, or longing of another kind. The monk who stands barefoot on the bank tonight was once a boy with other dreams. The old ferryman was once newly married. The merchant was once poor. The king was once held in someone's arms. Everything flows, and because everything flows, attachment wounds and wisdom softens. If you listen carefully, you can almost feel the pace of this world settling around you. Not the pace of battle or proclamation, but the slower rhythm by which most people have always lived. A bowl filled, a net mended, a prayer repeated, a lamp lit, a child soothed, a body bathed, a debt remembered, a silence shared. The great teachings of an age do not float above such moments. They move through them. The Buddha's insight into suffering, impermanence, and release was heard not only in groves and monasteries, but in places like this, where ordinary people came to the edge of water with ordinary hearts. Tonight the river will carry us among them, not in haste, not with the sharpness of history recited from a distance, but gently, as though we are drifting past one bank and then another, seeing little fires appear, hearing fragments of speech, noticing how the lives of strangers glow for a moment in the dark, before becoming part of the greater quiet again. We will let the Ganges be our guide, because a river knows how to move forward without struggling against each bend. It knows how to hold the moon in pieces. It knows how to travel through villages, wilderness, ceremony, commerce, and sorrow without ceasing to be water. And perhaps, as we follow it, some softer understanding will rise. Not that ancient people were different from us in their hearts, but that they were close to many of the same questions. What can ease suffering? What can be kept? What must be let go? Can blessing be received from outside us? Or must peace be uncovered within? Why do we reach for what slips away? Why does beauty feel sharper because it passes? What did men and women standing on these banks truly seek when they entered the water at dawn, or sat beside it after sunset, or listened for meaning in the endless sound of the current moving through the dark? These are the questions sleeping beneath the surface of this night. So rest beside the river now, in imagination if nowhere else. Let its breadth widen the mind. Let its darkness be gentle rather than empty. Let the old world gather around you, the broad plain cooling under starlight, the last boat pulled in, the reeds whispering at the edge, the smoke from evening fires thinning into the sky, the distant bell or chant fading into stillness. The Ganges is here as earth and water, but also as memory, as path, as patient witness to longing. It has watched generation after generation come, seeking purity, comfort, blessing, and relief. And it has flowed on beside a teaching that says the truest freedom cannot be poured over the body, cannot be purchased by offering, cannot be borrowed from ritual, because it waits in the quiet transformation of the heart. Now the first stars begin to appear above the water, delicate and far away, and the river, dark beneath them, seems to hold even more than before. As their faint light gathers on the moving surface, the banks themselves begin to speak, not in grand events but in ordinary lives, the kind that filled this ancient world with its deepest and quietest meaning. And so, before the world fully reveals itself, the riverbank enters that tender hour when night has not quite loosened its hold, and morning has not yet claimed the land. The stars are still faintly present above the dark current, though their sharpness has softened, and a cool mist lies low over the Ganges, drifting just above the surface like breath over a sleeping body. The water moves beneath it with a sound so gentle it almost disappears into silence. And now and then, from somewhere beyond sight, comes the small hollow rhythm of an oar dipping into the river. The sound travels far in the dimness. It reaches the mud walls of sleeping homes, the tethered cattle, the reeds along the shallows, the worn stone steps where bare feet will soon gather. It reaches those who are half awake already, listening without fully meaning to, held for one more moment between rest and duty. In the villages along the Ganges, dawn does not arrive all at once. It gathers slowly, in textures and hints. A clay lamp left burning through the night near a doorway shrine trembles and begins to fail, its flame shrinking low in its little pool of oil. Smoke from a banked hearth, stirred back to life by a careful hand, leaks from a roof opening and lingers in the damp air. Somewhere a child turns in sleep. Somewhere an old man coughs. Somewhere a woman, long practiced in waking before the light, sits up from her mat and wraps her cloth more tightly around her shoulders against the chill that rises from the earth before sunrise. The ground is cool underfoot, darkened by dew. The packed paths between homes hold the night's moisture, and each step leaves a soft mark in the damp dust. Doors made of reed or wood are lifted or pushed aside with familiar restraint. No one in this hour moves with display. The body knows what must be done before the mind has fully entered the day. A hand reaches for a water pot. Another gathers dry kindling kept safe from the mist. A girl, still heavy with sleep, is nudged gently awake to accompany her mother to the river. Two brothers, not yet men but already folded into labor, rise to check the rope at the cattle post and brush the sleep from their faces with cool fingers. The village begins not with noise, but with small acts of return. Return to fire, return to water, return to grain, return to the same motions repeated so often that they seem part of the land itself. Yet within that repetition there is feeling, and beneath habit there is always a human heart. One person wakes carrying yesterday's fatigue in the back and shoulders. Another wakes with an anxious thought already waiting. Whether the field will drink enough this season, whether a child's fever has truly passed, whether a husband traveling upriver will come home before the moon changes. Another wakes with no grand worry, only the plain knowledge that there is much to do, and that the doing of it will fill every hour. At the river steps, shapes emerge through the mist. Women come balancing rounded clay jars at the hip or against the waist, their pace steady, practiced, quiet. Some descend the steps alone, some in pairs. Some with daughters who have only recently become strong enough to carry a smaller vessel of their own. The stone is slick with moisture, worn smooth by generations of feet, and each step is taken with care. At the water's edge, they bend, dip, lift, steady. The river gives itself without speech. A jar fills with a glugging breath. Another is rinsed first, turned in the hand, then lowered deeper. The surface breaks in widening rings that vanish almost as soon as they appear. These jars will return to courtyards and kitchens, to washing, cooking, drinking, and prayer. This water will be poured into cups, mixed with grain, offered to guests, splashed over sleepy faces, set near altars, carried to the sick. It will cool clay, soften rice, cleanse hands, receive flowers, and ease thirst after labor beneath the sun. Before the day has even begun in full, the river has already entered the life of every household. Near another stretch of bank, a man unties a narrow boat and pushes it free of the mud with his heel. He does not speak. The wood creaks softly as he steps in, and his oar finds the water with the confidence of long use. Perhaps he will check nets set in the dark. Perhaps he will ferry someone across later, when the sky brightens. Perhaps he goes toward another village with baskets, salt, oil, or news. The route is Pruhath before it is anyone else's horizon. In this hour, while most homes are only beginning to stir, he is already in motion, part of that older current of necessity that joins labor to water and water to survival. From the huts nearest the fields comes the faint knocking sound of grain being pounded. A pestle rises and falls in a measured rhythm, unhurried but exact. Inside a low room, a woman leans into the work with quiet strength, separating husk from what will nourish the family through the day. Beside her, embers stirred back to brightness catch on dry straw. A small flame lifts, then another. Soon the scent of smoke and warming clay mingles with the smell of wet earth drifting in from outside. Someone grinds lentils. Someone rinses a pot. Someone ties back her hair and pauses only briefly to stretch the ache from her wrists. There is tenderness here, though it is not always spoken. A mother sets aside the cleanest portion for the youngest child. A husband, leaving early, places an extra piece of wood by the hearth so the fire will not fail too soon. A grandmother, awake before all the others, folds a cloth and lays it ready where small hands can reach it. In the half-light, appears in practical forms. It is not dramatic, it is woven into the ordinary. A vessel lifted for another, a task taken quietly, a sleeping child covered against the cold. These gestures do not stop suffering, but they soften its edges, and fatigue lives here too, openly if silently. The woman carrying water may have done the same yesterday, with a sore back, and the day before with swollen feet. The farmer stepping toward the field may still feel last season's disappointments settled in his chest. The old laborer, warming his hands over the first fire, may know that his strength does not answer him as it once did. The young bride in a new household may still be learning the rhythms expected of her, trying not to falter, trying to belong. The repetition of these mornings is both anchor and burden. It gives shape to life, and it also reveals how little can be escaped. Yet even within the weariness there is hope, modest and persistent. Hope does not always arrive as a grand dream. Often it is smaller, steadier than that. It is the hope that the pot will stay uncracked, that the calf will feed well, that the river will not recede too far, that the grain will last, that no illness will enter the house, that work done faithfully will carry the family one more day towards safety. It is the hope that a daughter will marry kindly, that a son will learn patience, that an absent loved one will return by boat or road with dust on his feet and stories in his mouth. In villages like these, hope is not separate from labor. It breathes through it. As the darkness thins, more sounds join the river's hush. A rooster calls from somewhere behind a fence of woven branches. Goats stir and knock lightly against their posts. A baby cries and is quickly soothed. Clay lids clink. Water pours from one vessel to another, with a silver note in the quiet in the distance. A temple bell may sound once, or a low chant may rise from a shrine where someone has begun the morning with folded hands. Ritual is not apart from life here. It moves within it. The same water that fills a cooking pot may also be touched to the forehead. The same hands that sweep a yard may later press together in reverence. The river belongs to devotion and to hunger at once. Along the shallows, a few villagers bathe. Before the light grows strong, they step into the cold water with sharp breaths, washing sleep from skin and thought alike. Some do so in silence, some with murmured prayers, some simply because the body must be cleansed before labor or worship. Ripples spread around their legs, mist curls around shoulders and hair. When they emerge, droplets cling to the skin and catch the first paling of the sky. There is humility in these acts, and there is continuity. Parents have done this before children, and their parents before them. The river receives each generation without choosing among them. Beyond the houses, fields wait under a grey-blue sky. Channels cut from the river's gift hold moisture in the soil. The crops, whether barley, rice, millet, or cane, depend on timings far larger than any one household can command. Men and women who walk toward those fields know this in their bones. Their lives are measured not only by sunrise and sunset, but by flood and drought, by sowing and cutting, by the moods of weather and the faithfulness of water. The Ganges is not an idea to them. It is the difference between enough and not enough. It is the quiet partner in every meal, every season, every plan made with cautious optimism. Children, once awake, begin to bring liveliness into the edges of morning. A little boy crouches near the doorway, tracing lines in the mud with a twig, while waiting to be given some task. A girl, balancing a small pot with fierce seriousness, tries to match the stride of her elder sister. Another child still blinks against sleep, hair rumpled, watching sparks leap from the rekindled fire as if seeing a wonder. In time they too will inherit these routines. They will learn which path to take in the rains, how deep to lower a jar, how to read the river's color, how to carry water without waste, how to wake before dawn and begin again. Memory is not kept only in stories. It is kept in the body, handed down through repeated movement. The elders of the village carry another kind of memory. Sitting near thresholds, or by slowly strengthening fires, they listen to the morning and measure it against many mornings that came before. They remember years when the river rose so high, it swallowed paths and courtyards. They remember lean, years when the banks cracked and cattle weakened. They remember births, marriages, departures and funerals, all accompanied in some way by the same flowing water. To them, the river holds not just usefulness, but witness. It has seen joy arrive unexpectedly. It has watched grief kneel at its edge. It has borne ashes, offerings, trade goods, prayers, rumors, and the reflections of faces now gone. There is something profoundly intimate in the way a village belongs to such a river. Not because life is easy there, but because nothing important can be imagined without it. The Ganges enters the morning meal, the day's labor, the cleansing of limbs, the blessing of shrines, the paths of merchants, the talk between neighbors, the songs remembered by widows, the stories told to children at dusk. It is where one washes the dust of the road away. It is where one sends a boat toward another settlement. It is where one stands in solitude after quarrel or loss, letting the moving water carry away words too heavy to keep repeating. It is where memory returns unbidden, attached to a scent, a reflection, a season, and still the light continues to grow, patient and unstoppable. The mist begins to lift in threads. The eastern sky warms from ash to pale gold. Reeds along the bank reveal their green more clearly, and the stone steps, damp and worn, begin to catch the first touch of sun. Faces that were shadowed are now visible in their particularity. Lined, youthful, weary, intent, gentle. The village, once only a scattering of shapes and sounds, gathers into form. Smoke rises straighter. Voices become more distinct. The day, with all its demands and chances, has truly begun. Now the river seems wider in the new light, less secret and more expansive. And what was moments ago a private companion of households begins to show another nature. Boats emerge from the haze. Farther banks declare themselves. Paths leading down to the water grow busy with feet from more than one settlement. As sunrise warms the reeds and stone steps, the Ganges becomes not only a source of life, but a road binding kingdoms and strangers together. In the strengthening light, the river reveals its traffic little by little, as though reluctant to surrender all its secrets at once. A dark shape near the far bank becomes a cargo boat low in the water, its sides stained by years of use, its hull carrying sacks of rice packed tightly beneath woven covers. Behind it comes another, narrower and longer, loaded with timber cut upstream, the logs bound in careful bundles that creak softly whenever the current shifts them. Then a third appears, broad-bellied and patient, with sealed jars of oil cushioned in straw, stacks of pottery nested inside one another, folded cloth wrapped against damp, and somewhere among these useful things, perhaps a little packet of fragrant spice whose scent will one day drift through a kitchen many days away from the bank. Such boats may seem ordinary, but they are the moving veins of a living world. They travel not only between villages, but between ways of life. A harvest gathered in one district becomes a meal in another. A pot shaped by fingers in a riverside kiln arrives intact in a town where the clay is different. Fine cotton woven in one kingdom passes into the hands of a merchant farther downriver, then to a household that will never know the face of the woman who spun the thread. A beam of wood cut from a forested shore may one day support the roof of a hall where merchants bargain, where children sleep, where a wandering ascetic is given shelter from rain. The river carries these things without preference. It bears need and luxury together, and in doing so, quietly teaches that no settlement thrives alone. The Ganges in the Buddha's time was not a lonely stretch of sacred water reserved only for prayer or ceremony. It was busy, practical, often noisy, and deeply human. Oars struck the water in regular rhythm. Ropes groaned. Men leaned their weight into poles near shallows, guiding a vessel away from hidden sandbanks. Calls moved from boat to shore and shore to boat, brief and direct, shaped by labor. Prices were debated. Space was negotiated. Animals, reluctant to board, had to be coaxed or pulled. Bundles were counted and counted again. Through all this, the river remained broad and unhurried, as if making room for the countless small urgencies of human life. Some boats belonged to families who had worked the water for generations. Their knowledge was not written in books, yet it was exact. They knew where the currents split around a submerged ridge. They knew which inlets looked calm, but concealed sucking mud. They could read the wind from the tremble of reed tops, and judge the coming weather by a change in light before noon. They knew where crocodiles were sometimes seen, where driftwood gathered after a storm, where the banks collapsed in the flood season, and which crossings grew dangerous when the river ran high and brown. A ferryman might not speak in the polished language of courts, but he understood timing, patience, risk, and balance in ways a minister perhaps never would. And because he stood all day where people came and went, he also became a keeper of voices. Few heard as much of the world as the one who rowed others across it. Traders waiting with carts spoke while watching the opposite bank. Laborers grumbled openly, too tired to guard their thoughts. A young servant sent ahead by a wealthy household might reveal more than intended. Pilgrims shared hopes, soldiers shared boasts, villagers shared suspicions. Monks exchanged reports of where rain's retreats had been observed, which monasteries were generous, which roads were unsafe, where a respected teacher had last been heard speaking. News of a court dispute, a marriage alliance, a failed crop, a tax demand, a birth in a noble family, a sickness in a market town, a debate among ascetics, a rumor of bandits on the road, all of it drifted toward the ferryman as naturally as leaves drift toward the bend of a stream. He did not need to ask much. People often speak when crossing water. Perhaps the brief uncertainty of being between one shore and another loosens the tongue. Perhaps the sound of the river gives a feeling of privacy, even when others sit only a hand's breadth away. Or perhaps being carried reminds people, if only dimly, that they are not fully in command, and so they become more honest than they intended. A ferryman could learn which prince was said to be ambitious, which merchant house had extended too much credit, which village elder had lost respect, which wandering teacher drew large crowds, which monastery had become known for discipline, kindness, or dispute. He might hear the same story told 3 ways before midday and know from the differences where truth was hiding. The traders, too, were collectors of the world, though they gathered it while in motion. Their business was goods, yet they trafficked just as surely in memory, comparison, and tale. A cloth merchant could tell you not only what a fabric cost upriver, but which town favored indigo, which preferred saffron dye, where roads had become safer under a new local ruler, and where a bridge had washed out so that river passage now mattered more than before. A spice seller might know how the air smelled in distant markets, and which inns welcomed monks without charge. A potter carrying wares for exchange knew where clay ran red, where black, where demand rose before festivals, and which settlements had recently grown large enough to support specialized craftsmen. To travel by river was to become threaded into an immense fabric of practical awareness. And all along these floating roads, people met who would otherwise never have stood so near one another. On a ferry no larger than a room, distinctions could not vanish, but they were forced into a closer arrangement. A field laborer with cracked heels and sun-browned shoulders might sit beside a merchant whose rings flashed when he adjusted his robe. A mother keeping one hand on her child's wrist might find herself opposite a monk holding an alms bowl wrapped in cloth. A wealthy patron traveling with attendants might wrinkle at the smell of fish nets drying near a boatman's feet, while an old pilgrim with dust on her hem stared quietly at the same stretch of water as if it were a scripture. Children, less obedient to social boundaries than their elders, might peer curiously at everyone alike. For the duration of the crossing, all were subject to the same small conditions. The boat rocked for each body. The wind touched each face. Spray landed without regard for status. If the ferryman asked for stillness while navigating a difficult pull of current, even the proud had to obey. Sandals, jewels, rough hands, perfumed oil, patched cloth, shaven heads, merchant ledgers, baskets of greens, clay jars, prayer beads, all crowded into one temporary nearness. No doctrine needed to be announced for the fact to be felt. However separate lives may seem on land, the river had a way of revealing their overlap. A child might notice it first in the most innocent way, watching sacks of grain loaded beside bundles of dyed cloth, listening to strangers speak of towns she has never seen. She begins to understand that the food in her bowl and the blanket on her sleeping mat come from journeys beyond her own small lane. A laborer hired to unload pottery may learn that the jars he lifts are headed for a monastery kitchen, where meals will be prepared for monks and guests. A rich donor on pilgrimage may overhear from a trader how flood damage in a poor district has raised the price of oil farther downriver. A monk, depending on alms, may cross paths with the carpenter, whose timber will repair a hall where teachings are given. Even those who never reflect deeply are still moved within this web. Their lives press against one another through exchange, service, burden, and chance. There is tenderness in this, but also vulnerability. Interdependence is not always gentle. When boats are delayed, markets tighten. When floodwaters rise too fiercely, whole chains of expectation tremble. A crop failure upstream is felt downstream in bowls and tempers. A local ruler's greed changes the price of passage. A rumor carried too quickly can wound reputations before truth catches up. A fever reaching one crowded riverside town may travel through contact and commerce to another. The same road that brings lamp oil, salt, cloth, and medicine can also carry fear, debt, and grief. Yet this too belongs to the teaching hidden in plain sight. No, life remains untouched by the movement of others. The current itself seems to say so. It accepts what enters it and alters everything by relation. A branch dropped from one bank may drift to the other. Silt from far away settles into a field where someone plants next season's grain. A boatman's delay changes who reaches market before dusk. A conversation overheard on a ferry may redirect a pilgrim's route, or inspire a merchant to seek a teacher, or lead a householder to send support to a monastery he has never seen. Causes meet conditions. Conditions ripen into consequences. The river makes visible what human beings often prefer to forget, that separateness is useful for naming things, but not for explaining how life truly happens. Imagine the ferry landing at mid-morning. The sun is higher now, and the smell of wet rope has warmed into something earthy and familiar. A bullock cart waits under a tree. Two monks stand in silence, their robes touched by dust at the hem. Nearby, A group of women with water jars pause to make space for a man carrying rolled mats on his shoulder. A trader argues over a fee, then laughs, realizing the ferryman will not be persuaded. A child asks too many questions. An old man, helped carefully into the boat, blesses everyone whether they want blessing or not. Someone begins speaking of a teacher whose words have unsettled many listeners, because they are simple and difficult at once. Someone else dismisses the report, then asks for more detail anyway. The crossing is short, but while it lasts, a whole society gathers in miniature. By afternoon, farther along the river, another scene unfolds. Broad cargo vessels move with heavier dignity, their crews bronzed by sun, their arms corded from work. On one boat, jars of sesame oil are secured beside baskets of lentils. On another, timber poles and planks are stacked with almost architectural precision. Fine cloth from a loom town is wrapped in oilskin to protect it from spray. Pottery, vulnerable but necessary, is wedged between straw and rope. Little packets of spice are tied high and dry, precious not because they feed hunger directly, but because they bring pleasure, medicine, offering, and memory. Men keeping account scratch marks on palm leaf or recite figures from memory. They know what was loaded, what was promised, what must arrive before the next market day. Yet even among arithmetic and obligation, there is always talk. Stories travel with the goods, because human beings cannot help attaching meaning to movement. A sack of rice may be accompanied by the tale of the season's first rains. A bolt of cloth may carry news of the weaver's daughter's wedding. Timber, from a distant stand of trees, might arrive along with a warning that forest roads are no longer safe after dark. Oil jars may come with a rumor that a royal household is preparing for a great event. Pottery may be delivered by a man who has spent the last 3 nights sleeping beneath different stars and has heard in each place a variation of the same question. Where may wisdom be found, and who among the many teachers truly sees? This was the river's deeper commerce, not only things but perceptions, not only wealth but orientation. Each traveler carried a little world inside him, and on the water, those worlds brushed against one another. A monk heard the worries of householders and remembered that suffering wears many garments. A merchant heard the calm speech of a renunciant and wondered whether gain alone could ever steady the heart. A ferryman listening year after year learned that people of rank and people of none both feared loss, both desired safety, both grieved their dead, both hoped to be seen kindly. Even children absorbed the lesson without naming it, that the world is larger than the village, and also smaller, because strangers are never wholly strange once you have sat beside them while crossing a river. Among those who depended on the river's steady traffic was an old lamp maker whose small workshop stood near a busy landing, where clay found along the banks was shaped, dried, and fired into the countless little vessels that would later carry flame into homes, shrines, and boats moving after dark. He had shaped lamps since he was a boy, learning from his father the exact pressure of thumb against wet clay, the precise thinness of a rim that would neither crack in the kiln nor smoke too heavily when lit. Merchants bought his lamps by the basketful to sell farther down river. Pilgrims bought single lamps to float upon the water at dusk, whispering wishes into flame before releasing them to the current. He rarely spoke of philosophy, though he had heard wandering teachers debate near his stall more times than he could count. What he understood, in his own quiet way, was this: that a lamp gave its whole self to the darkness without complaint, burning down steadily until nothing remained, and that this seemed to him a kind of goodness worth imitating. When a young apprentice once asked him why he took such care, shaping even the humblest lamp meant for a poor household, he answered that light did not know the difference between a rich man's shrine and a fisherman's doorway, and that his hands should not know the difference either. The apprentice remembered this long after the old man had died. and carried the same care into his own work, so that lamps shaped by that small riverside workshop continued for another generation to carry flame into the evening hush of villages up and down the Ganges. So the Ganges flowed on as roadway, marketplace, messenger, witness. It linked fields to cities, workshops to homes, monasteries to villages, courts to remote banks where news arrived late but still arrived. It allowed kingdoms to feel each other's pulse. It taught through repetition that movement is never solitary. Every oar stroke depended on a tree once rooted in soil. Every cargo depended on hands unseen by the buyer. Every crossing brought lives briefly into shared balance. The river did not preach this. It simply enacted it. Day after day under sun and cloud, in flood and in calm, before those with eyes to notice. And among those who traveled the river roads were seekers who believed liberation might be waiting just beyond the next bend. They came in many forms. Some arrived barefoot, their feet hardened by long roads and hot dust, their ribs visible beneath skin, browned by sun and wind. Some wore the white garments of household priests and reciters, their hair oiled, their speech careful, their memory filled with old verses handed down through generations. Some lived alone for seasons at a time, and came down from the edge of the woods only to gather alms, wash in the river, or speak a few measured words with those who asked for counsel. Others moved in little groups, students around a teacher, carrying water pots, staffs, mats of grass, and the seriousness of those who believed they had found a path worth following. Near bathing places, under groves of sala and banyan, beside ferry landings where traffic slowed and people naturally gathered, these men and women of discipline could often be found. At dawn, the mist might still be rising from the water when the first among them stepped down the muddy bank to bathe. In the cool half-light, with birds only beginning to stir, they entered the river with prayers on their lips. Some dipped once, some 3 times. Some stood waist-deep facing the sun as if the body itself could become a vessel of purity through exact and repeated acts. On the shore, others waited with folded robes, watching closely, as though every gesture mattered. Purity meant one thing to one person, and something quite different to another. For some, purity was a matter of lineage, of correct recitation, of keeping oneself undefiled by the touch of what was forbidden. For some, it was fire ritual, sacrifice, offering, the faithful maintenance of a cosmic order older than memory. For some, purity lay in refusal, refusing rich food, comfort, ornaments, sleep, heat, shelter, speech. They believed that by stripping life down to its barest frame, truth would finally stand revealed. There were those who fasted until the eyes sank deep, those who slept on thorns or rough earth, those who held the arms raised until they trembled and stiffened, those who wandered naked to prove they had cut all ties to shame and possession. There were forest recluses who sought silence, meditators who turned inward toward the movements of mind, teachers who argued that the soul was eternal, and others who insisted that the self dissolved like foam. The riverbank heard them all. It heard the murmured cadences of ancient hymns and the sharp debate of wandering philosophers. It heard stories of heavens bright with reward and warnings of hells shaped by one's own deeds. It heard assurances that a properly performed rite could carry the dead onward, and quieter suggestions that no priest, no offering, no inherited privilege could save a person from the harvest of their own intentions. Questions drifted through the groves almost as often as incense smoke. What survives death? Can suffering be exhausted? Is the world ruled by fate, by gods, by action, by chance, by an unchanging self, or by nothing stable at all? Is release won through discipline, through knowledge, through sacrifice, through devotion, through purity of birth, or through some deeper transformation not visible from the outside? No single answer silenced the others for long. That age, like the river, was full of current. One stream of thought met another and swirled. Old certainties stood, but they no longer stood alone. Kingdoms were growing, towns were expanding, trade moved farther. People met strangers who spoke differently, prayed differently, and reasoned differently. A farmer could hear one teaching in his village and another at a market town 2 days away. A merchant who traveled often might return not only with salt or cloth, but with stories of a teacher in a distant grove who spoke of freedom from rebirth, or of another who denied that actions bore fruit, or of another who claimed perfect knowledge through severe penance. Even those who never left home felt the reach of these wider conversations. A son returned changed. A widow gave food to a passing ascetic, and then pondered his words all afternoon. A ferryman listened to debates without meaning to, and later repeated them by lamplight to his family. Beneath all this speaking was hunger, not the ordinary hunger of the belly, though that too was known by many. This was the hunger that wakes when a funeral fire has cooled and yet grief has not. The hunger that grows when a child is born, and suddenly love is shadowed by fear. The hunger that follows success and whispers, "Is this all?" The hunger that appears in old age, when the hands that once worked with confidence begin to shake, and the mirror of water shows a face becoming unfamiliar. People sought teachings because they had seen bodies weaken, seen crops fail, seen friendships break, seen desire promise much and keep little. They had watched the pyres, heard the mourning songs, touched the ashes, and felt with painful intimacy that no wall of wealth or custom could finally keep loss away. Many came to the river carrying invisible burdens. A mother who had buried 2 children might descend the steps with flowers and tears, hoping the merit of offerings would reach where her arms no longer could. A man who had cheated his brother in a division of land might bathe with fervor, trying to wash away not dirt but memory. A young student, praised for intelligence, might secretly fear that all his learning was only a polished answer to questions he did not dare face alone at night. A prince might hear of renunciance and feel a shock of envy, wondering whether the guarded life of privilege was itself another kind of prison. A laborer with no leisure for philosophy might still look at the passing river and feel, in some unspoken place within, the ache to rest in something that did not shift. So they fasted, they chanted, they argued, they endured heat, cold, silence, hunger, sleeplessness. They sought teachers with reputations for holiness. They measured progress through signs the world could see. A lean body, a simple robe, a hut of leaves, a bowl with little in it, a vocabulary of restraint, a reputation for discipline. And to be fair, sincerity was often present. It would be too simple and too unkind to imagine all these seekers as proud or foolish. Many were earnest beyond words. Many had left behind comfort, not for admiration, but because something in them could no longer accept an easy life, while death remained unconquered and sorrow remained unexplained. Their striving came from a wound shared by all beings, even if they named it differently. Yet earnest effort does not always bring peace. A man may sit motionless under a tree and still be pursued by his own thoughts. A woman may repeat sacred formulas until her voice is steady, while inside the heart continues to tremble. One ascetic may conquer appetite only to become proud of conquest. Another may abandon possessions while clinging tightly to views. A Brahmin may know every syllable of a revered verse, and still lie awake wondering whether knowledge borrowed from tradition has ripened into understanding. A hermit may flee the crowd, only to discover that solitude gives clearer shape to fear rather than dissolving it. Outward austerity can be impressive. It can inspire reverence. It can also conceal uncertainty so private that no onlooker suspects its depth. In the heat of afternoon, when shadows were short and conversation slowed, some seekers sat with faces composed as carved stone. Villagers passing by might assume they had gone beyond ordinary agitation. But within, the currents could still be rough. Had they chosen the right practice? Were they advancing or merely enduring? Was pain purifying them? If a vision came in meditation, was it truth or self-deception? If calm appeared briefly, why did it vanish? If the body was subdued, why did longing return in subtler forms? Longing to be recognized, longing to be certain, longing to finally stop seeking. These questions rarely announced themselves in public. In public there were forms to maintain, students to guide, teachings to defend. Yet the river, if we imagine it listening, knew how many human beings came to it, with faces arranged and hearts unsettled. It saw the priest after the ritual, alone for a moment, looking out over the current with an expression almost childlike in its fatigue. It saw the severe wanderer accept alms with practiced detachment, and then glance, just once, at a family sharing their midday meal under a tree, as if remembering another life. It saw disciples whisper after their teacher slept, confessing doubts they would never reveal in daylight. It saw wealthy patrons praise renunciation, and then quietly pray not for wisdom, but for prosperity, healthy sons, safe journeys and long life. This was not hypocrisy alone, it was humanity. Human beings often seek the highest while still aching with ordinary fears. They want liberation, and they also want tomorrow to be kind. They speak of truth beyond self, and still they dread pain in the body and separation from the beloved. Along the Ganges in those centuries, the search for ultimate release did not float above daily life like something abstract and distant. It grew right out of it, out of cremation smoke, out of monsoon uncertainty, out of childbirth cries and wedding songs, out of taxes, sickness, ambition, memory, desire, disappointment, and that strange, tender knowledge that everything precious can vanish. No wonder the groves were full. No wonder people listened when a traveler said, "I have heard a remarkable teacher nearby." No wonder debates drew crowds, and no wonder silence did too. The age was rich in doctrines because it was rich in need. Every claim about truth found listeners because every listener already carried some form of unrest. One person wanted assurance that the dead were not lost. Another wanted a discipline strong enough to tame the senses. Another wanted a moral law that made suffering intelligible. Another wanted to step outside the wheel of gain and loss altogether. And some, perhaps many, did not know exactly what they wanted. They only knew that the life available to them, however respectable or prosperous, did not quiet the deeper unease. At evening, when the western sky softened and the river held streaks of copper and rose, these many paths seemed to share the same light. Smoke from cooking fires rose behind village houses. Cows came home. Children called to one another. Temple bells, bird cries, and the creak of moored boats mixed gently in the cooling air. Seekers returned to their resting places, to huts or groves or open ground. Some felt renewed, some felt empty, some clung more tightly to their practices. Some, though they did not yet admit it, were beginning to suspect that neither indulgence nor self-torment had touched the root of what troubled them. And still the Ganges moved on, bearing chants and questions, vows and weariness, confidence and doubt. It passed bathing stairs where the faithful prayed for cleansing. It passed lonely inlets where hermits sat in meditation. It passed cities where learned men refined old systems into sharper arguments. It passed reed beds and ferry points where ordinary people looked out over the water and wondered, in their own quiet way, whether peace was truly possible in this life. The whole landscape seemed to be listening for an answer, though no one could quite say from where it would come. The teachers already known spoke with conviction. The rituals continued. The disciplines hardened and multiplied. Yet the searching did not end. It deepened. It spread. It gathered like evening coolness after a harsh day, touching householders and wanderers alike. Into this world of questions and disciplines, the Buddha appears with a stillness unlike the river's ceaseless movement. He does not arrive like a conqueror, and he does not move through the Ganges plain like a man trying to seize the attention of the world. He comes on foot, often in the company of monks whose robes catch the soft light of morning and evening, and there is something so balanced in his presence that people notice him before they understand why. The roads of that age are dusty in the hot months, softened into mud by rain, lined at times with groves, fields, shrines, rest houses, and the edges of growing towns. Along those roads he travels from one place to another, from the edge of a kingdom to a quiet woodland retreat, from crowded settlements to mango groves lent by patrons, from places of debate to places where no one is thinking of philosophy at all, only of the next meal, the next birth, the next grief. Word moves ahead of him in the ordinary way that news always travels. No herald is needed. A potter hears from a customer that a sage has been teaching nearby. A woman drawing water at a well hears another say that there is a wandering teacher whose speech is unlike the speech of Brahmins, and unlike the self-mortifying holy men who frighten children. Merchants resting beneath woven awnings in the market talk between themselves while flies circle fruit baskets and jars of oil. Someone says he speaks calmly, without anger. Someone else says that after hearing him, a man who had long been tormented by loss wept quietly, then sat as if a weight had shifted in his chest. A ferryman carrying passengers through the broad current repeats scraps of teachings he only half remembers, and even those fragments seem to stir something. So people begin to watch the roads. They hear of him in shaded courtyards where the day's heat settles into brick and packed earth. They hear of him while pounding grain, while folding cloth, while waiting for a debtor, while tending a sick parent. In the river towns, rumor mingles with the smell of wet wood, smoke, cooked dung fires, sweat, lotus roots and damp reeds in larger places, where disputes over lineage and purity and doctrine can fill an afternoon. His name passes from mouth to mouth with curiosity first, then with a strange kind of hope. Not everyone knows what to expect. Some imagine another severe ascetic. Some expect an inspired philosopher ready to defeat rivals with dazzling speech. Some think perhaps he will offer blessings, or charms, or a more perfect ritual. But when they come near him, what many remember is not display. They remember a man who seemed fully there. He could sit beneath a tree while villagers gathered in uneven circles, children at the back, elders near the front, laborers still carrying dust on their ankles. And somehow the place would grow quieter without anyone being ordered into silence. The quiet around him was not the brittle quiet of fear. It was not the theatrical stillness people create when they expect a miracle. It was gentler than that, more human. It was the quiet that comes when people feel, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that they do not need to pretend. This is part of what made his presence so powerful in the riverine world. Life along the Ganges was full of encounters, transactions, duties, losses, and constant movement. Men bargained. Women carried the hidden burdens of households. Children learned early how fragile things were. The old watched strength leave the limbs, feared thieves, fever, flood, and bad harvests. Even the wealthy, protected by walls and servants, could not keep age from entering the gate. Beneath customs and status, beneath sacrifice and learning, there was the same unease beating in many hearts. People worried over what they had done and what they had failed to do. They feared separation from what they loved. They feared being trapped in patterns they could not name. They feared that all the rituals in the world might leave untouched the sorrow that returned at night. And then there was this teacher who spoke as if he understood the human mind from the inside, not as a judge standing above it, but as one who had looked deeply into its restlessness. When people came to him, he did not seem interested in flattering them. He did not tell the proud that they were already wise. He did not tell the grieving to stop grieving, as if tenderness were weakness. He did not demand that ordinary people become other than human before they were worthy of hearing the truth. If a mother mourned, He met the reality of mourning. If a farmer worried over the uncertainty of rains and prices and family obligations, he did not dismiss these concerns as beneath spiritual life. If a young man burned with ambition or lust or resentment, the Buddha spoke to those fires directly, not with contempt, but with clarity. That clarity could be unsettling, because it was so simple. He spoke of suffering in ways that did not feel abstract. He spoke of craving, of attachment, of the way the mind reaches, grasps, resists, and then wonders why it cannot rest. He spoke of impermanence not as a cold theory, but as the honest shape of life. Bodies changing, seasons turning, relationships shifting, fortunes rising and falling like water levels after rain. For those who had lived under the pressure of ceremonies and inherited obligations, this teaching opened a different doorway. It did not begin by asking what family one came from or what precise formula one had recited. It began with what one could observe in one's own experience: stress, longing, confusion, tenderness, anger, fear, and the possibility that these did not have to rule the heart forever. One can imagine him in a riverside settlement at dusk, after the worst heat has passed. The cattle have been brought in. Smoke rises in thin lines into the deepening sky. A ferry has made its last crossing for the evening. People gather because someone has said he is here. They do not know exactly what they seek. Some stand with folded arms, skeptical. Some sit forward with an eagerness they are embarrassed to show. Some come because everyone else has come. A few come carrying private pain they have not spoken aloud even to family. Then he begins to speak. Perhaps his voice is not loud. It does not need to be. Those nearest hear first. Then those behind them lean into the sound. His words do not race. He gives each thought enough space to enter the listener's own life. He might speak of the mind as something trainable, not fixed. He might speak of anger as a flame that burns the one who clings to it. He might speak of generosity, not as a transaction with the heavens, but as a way of loosening fear. He might speak of conduct, of restraint, of attention, of the strange freedom that appears when one stops feeding every impulse. And while he speaks, some begin to feel that he is describing them more truthfully than they have ever described themselves. That feeling of being seen clearly may have been one of the deepest comforts he offered. Not praise, not enchantment, recognition. A merchant burdened by success and distrust might hear in the Buddha's teaching an explanation for the unease that profit could not soothe. A widow might hear that pain is part of life, but that despair need not be the whole of it. A servant accustomed to invisibility might, for an hour, find himself addressed as a human being whose mind and actions matter. A Brahmin trained in the old forms might hear, perhaps with resistance at first, a challenge more intimate than argument. Not what have you memorized, but what have you understood in your own heart. A young monk or wanderer, tired of extremes, might hear in the middle way not compromise, but relief. The Buddha's dignity had room in it for everyone. That does not mean everyone agreed with him. Some surely doubted him. Some listened politely and left unchanged. Some may have been irritated by the way he cut through cherished assumptions. Yet even disagreement around him often had a different atmosphere than the vanity contests of intellectual life. He answered questions. He adapted examples to the people before him. To the farmer he could speak in images of seeds and cultivation. To the ruler he could speak of governance and self-mastery. To those overwhelmed by domestic life he could speak in practical terms. Guard the mind, speak truthfully, act with care, observe cause and effect again and again. The teaching bent toward lived reality. This mattered deeply in the world watered by the Ganges. Because the river touched every station of life, the Buddha's teaching also moved across boundaries. It could be heard near monastic groves, but also near docks and courtyards, beside fields and workshops, under pavilions where traders haggled, and under trees where the poor rested in the shade. A person did not have to step outside the human condition to hear him. In a way, that was the startling thing. He met people before they were purified, before they were calm, before they were wise. He spoke to them in the midst of dust, grief, hunger, longing, family entanglement, memory, and regret. And somehow this did not lower the spiritual vision. It made it more compassionate. It suggested that awakening was not a luxury for the remote and exceptional alone. It was related to the way one walked, spoke, earned, cared, restrained, listened, and understood. Even when he taught monks and nuns a disciplined path of renunciation, there remained this practical tenderness in the way his presence reached householders. He knew the noise of the world, and he knew the mind that trembles inside it. His teaching did not scold people for being wounded by life. It showed them how suffering is woven, and how it might be unwoven. In places where ritual purity held great importance, this must have carried a quiet force. The Ganges was loved, feared, revered. Its waters had long been associated with cleansing, with renewal, with contact between the earthly and the sacred. People bathed, prayed, offered, and believed that contact with holy water could wash away defilement. The Buddha did not need to mock that faith to turn attention inward. Simply by speaking as he did, by revealing greed, hatred, and delusion as the real stains clouding the heart, he shifted the center of the question. So perhaps after listening to him, someone would walk back toward the river differently. The steps to the water were still there. The current still flowed with the same ancient authority. Evening lamps might still tremble in the darkening air, but now another thought had entered the mind. If a person enters the river while still clutching resentment, is resentment washed away? If one speaks sacred words yet continues to wound others, what has been cleansed? If the body is cooled by water, but the mind remains fevered with craving, where does true purification begin? Soon the river that had long been trusted for ritual cleansing becomes the setting for a deeper question about what truly purifies the heart. And so the question lingers at the edge of the water. Before sunrise, when the world is still held in a blue-grey hush, people begin to gather at the ghats. Their footsteps are soft on the worn stone. A shawl is drawn tighter against the dawn chill. A brass vessel catches the first weak light. Somewhere a conch sounds, low and resonant, and from another place comes the murmur of a prayer, half-whispered, half-breathed into the cool air. The Ganges moves beside them with a patience older than kingdoms, receiving each arrival without judgment. Some come alone, some come in families, with children blinking sleep from their eyes and elders leaning carefully on younger arms. Some descend with practiced devotion, knowing each gesture by memory, each touch of water, each mantra, each bow. Others hesitate for a moment on the final step, as if gathering courage before entering not only a river, but hope itself. They carry so much with them. A mother grieving a son, a merchant exhausted by dishonesty, he no longer knows how to escape. A widow who has spoken to no one of her loneliness. A farmer worried over failed rains and thin soil. A young man ashamed of an angry word he hurled at his father. A woman who has kept a sorrow hidden so long it feels woven into her bones. There are regrets that can be named and regrets too tangled for speech. There are secret wishes, promises made in desperation, and the ancient longing, simple and human, to leave one's burden somewhere beyond the reach of memory. So they step into the water. The cold rises around their ankles, their knees, their waists. Breath catches in the chest, hands fold, lips move, eyes close. Some dip once, some 3 times. Some remain standing with palms lifted toward the brightening sky. The river touches skin made warm by sleep, skin marked by age and labor, skin scented with dust, smoke, oil, and everyday life. For a few moments there is an unmistakable tenderness in the act. The body bows to something greater. The mind reaches toward mercy. The heart, so often clenched against pain, loosens a little. It would be easy, from a distance, to misunderstand such scenes. Easy to speak too quickly, to flatten devotion into superstition, to treat ritual as though it were only habit or fear, but that would miss something essential. People did not come to the river merely because custom told them to come. They came because human beings ache for renewal. They came because sorrow seeks a form through which it can be carried. They came because guilt is heavy, because loss is bewildering, because there are mornings when a person simply needs to believe that life still offers a way to begin again. And in that sense, the river gave something real. It gave rhythm to grief. It gave shape to repentance. It gave the lonely a place to stand among others. It gave the anxious a gesture to perform when words failed them. To bend, to pray, to immerse, to rise dripping in the dawn light. These acts could steady a trembling mind. They could remind the weary that they belonged to a world larger than private suffering. They could bring a kind of relief, if only for the span of a morning. There is dignity in that. There is tenderness in the sincere wish to be made clean. The Buddha, it seems, understood this tenderness. He did not speak with the cruelty of someone eager to humiliate faith. He did not mock those who sought comfort at the water's edge. He knew too well the pain that drives people toward every promise of purification. He knew the rawness of the human heart, its fear of consequence, its hunger for release, its yearning to believe that what has been broken may yet be mended. But compassion does not always confirm the beliefs we cling to. Sometimes, compassion asks a deeper question. If a person enters the river with a mind burning in hatred, does the hatred dissolve in the current? If greed has shaped one's choices for years, if deception has become the tongue's habit, if envy rises each time another person prospers, can flowing water reach those hidden chambers and clear them out like silt from a canal? The river may cool the skin, it may refresh the senses, it may awaken reverence. Yet the old patterns of mind, unless seen and understood, travel back to shore with the bather. This was the shift the Buddha offered, and it was a profound of beauty, but a recentering of what cleansing means. For him, the deepest stains were not dust on the body, nor even the memory of ritual impurity. The real defilements were greed, hatred, and delusion, the forces that distort perception, poison intention, and lead people to wound themselves and one another. These were not removed by submersion. They were not frightened away by sacred geography. They did not loosen their grip because lips recited a formula while the mind remained untouched. They endured wherever ignorance endured. To hear this in the Buddha's time must have been both unsettling and relieving. Unsettling because it placed responsibility where no river could carry it away. A person could no longer rely entirely on an outward act while preserving inward habits. One had to look directly at anger, not ceremonially rinse around it. One had to acknowledge craving, not merely hope it would drift downstream. One had to recognize the blindness by which the mind invents permanence, possession, and self-importance, then suffers when these illusions crack. That is harder than bathing. Harder than prayer spoken at dawn, harder because no one else can do that work for you, and yet relieving too, because it meant that liberation was not reserved for those who lived near a holy river, or for those with the means and time to perform elaborate rites. The path to purification was suddenly intimate, portable, immediate. It could begin anywhere, on a riverbank, yes, but also in a forest hut, along a dusty road, in a crowded village, in the silence after an argument, in the instant one notices the heat of resentment rising. Purity was no longer dependent on contact with special water. It was bound to awareness, to ethical conduct, to the patient training of the heart. How gentle and radical that is. To refrain from harming, to speak truthfully, to act with care, to observe the mind as it clings, fears, fantasizes, and hardens. To notice the spark before it becomes a fire. To understand suffering not as a curse laid upon us from outside, but as something woven through craving and misunderstanding. This is a different kind of washing altogether. It does not happen all at once. It does not leave the skin shining by sunrise. It may be invisible to others, but over time, anger softens, compulsion weakens, illusions lose some of their authority. Compassion grows where pride once stood, and in that quiet transformation, something truly unclean begins to clear. Still, the river remains. It remains beautiful in the first light, silver where the sun touches it, dark where shadows still linger beneath the steps. It remains sacred in feeling, not because it can magically erase every moral wound, but because generations poured longing into it, and longing itself has a holiness when it is honest. The Ganges held tears, vows, songs, ashes, blessings, and the breath of countless prayers. It gathered the trembling of people who wanted to start again. That cannot be dismissed. Even from the Buddha's deeper perspective, one can still imagine the hush of dawn there and feel reverence. Perhaps that is the most humane way to understand the tension. The outer act is not worthless. It can calm, focus, humble, and console. It can prepare the mind. It can express devotion in a language older than argument. But if it is mistaken for the whole work, then something essential is missed. Water can symbolize release, yet symbols ask to be fulfilled inwardly. The dip in the river becomes meaningful when it is joined to the letting go of cruelty, deceit, vanity, and grasping. Without that, the body emerges wet, while the heart remains as burdened as before. One can almost picture a listener, in those days hearing the Buddha speak, then returning to the Ganges at dawn, with altered understanding. The same bells ring, the same priests chant, the same ripples spread from each descending foot. But now, while the person cups water in both hands and lets it fall again, another prayer forms quieter, more searching. May I cleanse not only my limbs but my intentions. May I not return from this river to the same harsh speech. May I release the grudges I rehearse in secret. May I see clearly the craving that keeps me restless. May I do no harm today then. The river becomes not an answer, but a companion to the real answer. Its flow begins to mirror impermanence. Its clarity becomes a reminder of clarity of mind. Its ceaseless movement suggests the passing of all conditions. What was once sought from the water alone is gradually discovered within experience itself. Through attention and discipline, the sacred does not vanish. It deepens. It moves from the hand and skin toward conscience, perception, and being. And what a tender thing that is to realize. The truest purification may not be dramatic. It may happen in moments so small they would escape the notice of anyone standing nearby. The pause before speaking in anger, the decision not to deceive, the willingness to admit fault, the courage to sit still with grief instead of turning it into bitterness, the patient return of the wandering mind to awareness, again and again. These are humble acts, almost invisible, yet they wash the heart more surely than any current. By the banks of the Ganges, such insight must have felt both intimate and immense. The world did not need to be stripped of its old symbols. Rather, the symbols were asked to open. The sacred river could still glimmer in dawn's first gold. People could still enter it with reverence. But the meaning of cleansing was no longer left outside the self. It had to be lived, embodied, practiced in thought and word and deed. So the murmurs at the bathing steps continue, soft as mist above the water. Hands still rise in prayer. Droplets still fall from hair and shoulders back into the current. Yet beside these ancient gestures, another way of listening quietly takes shape. Attention turns from the chill of the river on the skin to the subtler currents of the mind. From ritual utterance to inward honesty. From the beauty of flowing water to the discipline of awakening. And from those stone steps, from those sacred whispers and the hush between them, our gaze slowly drifts away from the bathers toward quieter places nearby, where monks and nuns sat listening to the same river, hearing in its endless movement not only blessing, but truth. Not far from the bathing steps, where prayers rose with the morning mist, there were quieter edges of life along the Ganges, a little beyond the movement of traders, pilgrims, ferrymen and householders. The Sangha found places to dwell near groves, sandy banks, and shaded clearings where the river could still be heard. These were not places made grand by ornament. They were made steady by repetition, by restraint, by the humble effort of people who had chosen to train the heart day after day. If one were to walk there in the pale light before sunrise, the first thing noticed might not be any human voice at all, but the breathing hush of the river itself, moving through darkness toward dawn. In that hour, the air would often be cool enough to raise a faint shiver on the skin. A robe washed the day before might hang over a line or branch, still carrying the damp fragrance of water and cloth. Another might already be dry, its folds touched by the earliest grey-blue light. These simple garments, dyed in muted earth tones, held no display. And yet in their very plainness there was something deeply moving. They told of renunciation, yes, but also of maintenance, of wear, of mending, of ordinary care. Someone had washed that robe, someone had wrung it out with tired hands. Someone had spread it carefully so that it would be ready again for another day of practice. Before the villages had fully stirred, monks and nuns would already be waking. Not every rising was serene. It is tempting, from a distance of centuries, to imagine spiritual communities as untouched by heaviness, as if every dawn found each practitioner refreshed, inwardly luminous and free of reluctance. But real bodies still ached. Sleep could be thin. The night might have brought mosquitoes, heat, restless thoughts, old memories, or the stiffness of age. A younger monk might wake with zeal one day and with dull resistance the next. A nun might sit up from her resting place, carrying both resolve and weariness in the same breath. Practice did not erase the human condition. It asked people to meet it honestly. So the first moments of the day were not always dramatic. Sometimes they were quiet acts of beginning again. A robe adjusted, a face rinsed, sand brushed from the feet, a bowl lifted with care. In the dimness, there may have been the soft rustle of cloth and the low sounds of movement among trees. If words were spoken, they were likely few. Silence in such communities was not emptiness for its own sake. It was a kind of protection, a way of not scattering the mind before the day had even begun. And under that silence, the river remained present, flowing steadily as if to remind each listener that no mood, no discomfort, no passing thought could stay for long. When the light strengthened, some would set out on arms round toward nearby settlements. It is easy to romanticize this too, but the alms round carried its own tenderness and humility. To walk into a village with bowl in hand was to place oneself visibly in dependence on others. The Sangha was not fed by self-sufficiency. It was sustained by relationship. A monk entering a lane lined with waking homes might smell rice steaming, hear a child crying, hear a goat shifting in its tether, hear women drawing water, hear the first exchanges of the morning between neighbors. A nun walking the same path on another day might lower her gaze and move with calm restraint while sensing, at the edges of awareness, the whole pulse of household life around her. Some people would give gladly, with reverence. Some might give because custom asked it. Some had little and still shared a spoonful of grain, a ladle of porridge, a piece of fruit, something cooked before dawn while embers still glowed red in the hearth. In such moments, spiritual life was not separate from ordinary struggle. The hand that offered food might belong to someone carrying grief, debt, illness, longing, or the fatigue of many responsibilities. The one receiving it had also left behind former identities and habits, and was learning to receive without greed, without shame. The exchange was small in outward form, yet filled with quiet significance. Generosity met restraint, need met discipline, worldly life and renunciant life touched for a breath, then moved on. By mid-morning, The returning footsteps would come back toward the riverside dwellings or groves. Bowls would be set down. Food would be arranged without excess. There was relief in eating, and perhaps this too deserves to be remembered with honesty. Hunger is not an illusion to the body. After a walk in the morning air, after standing and waiting in silence, after receiving what was given and no more, the first mouthful could bring simple gratitude. Warm rice, lentils, greens, roots, scraps of curry, fruit soft with ripeness, all of it taken mindfully. All of it enough. Not luxurious, not theatrical, simply enough. There is a dignity in enough that the world often forgets. And after the meal, there might come that familiar softening that follows necessity being met. A little relief in the limbs, a little steadiness in the mind. But the life of practice did not end at relief. The discipline continued. Bowls were cleaned. Dwelling places were tended. Paths may have been swept clear of leaves. Water was carried. Cloth was folded. Elders were respected. Teachings were remembered, discussed, recited, and tested against direct experience. The day was shaped not by constant intensity, but by rhythm. This rhythm, repeated over weeks and seasons, can it itself become a teacher. It reveals how much of the heart resists simplicity, and how much of the heart begins, slowly, to trust it. Through all of this, the Ganges remained nearby, not always visible from every resting place, but almost always audible. At times the sound would be broad and low, like a patient breath spread over distance. At times it would catch lightly against reeds, mudbanks, moored boats, or stones at the shore, producing gentler textures within the larger current. In the hot months, the river's voice might seem lazier at midday, as if heat had pressed even sound into stillness. In the rains, it could swell and deepen, reminding all who lived near it that calm surfaces are never the whole story. The monks and nuns did not need to invent symbols. The river offered them freely. What did it mean to sit beneath a tree while that current went on and on? Perhaps at first it meant distraction. A novice trying to settle the mind might notice every sound. The water, birds calling overhead, insects in the grass, branches moving, villagers passing in the distance, the shifting ache in the knees, the impatience that arises when stillness does not immediately become peace. The romantic image of meditation often erases this beginning, but Gunning's mind's as wander. Regret returns, desire returns, sleepiness arrives with great confidence. A practitioner might sit there hearing the river and feel not serenity, but irritation, dullness, or quiet disappointment. Yet this too belonged to the path. To notice restlessness was already different from being ruled by it. To hear the river without clinging to its beauty was already a subtle training. The water moved whether one was calm or agitated. It moved whether insight appeared or did not appear. It moved past reeds and root smoke, past fishermen and birds, past barges, cities, and empty stretches of shore. For the contemplative mind, this could become more than scenery. It could become a gentle instruction. Everything passes, yes, but not in a cold or punishing way. Passing is simply the nature of things. The breath passes, pain passes, joy passes, anger rises and thins, grief alters shape. Even the sense of self, so urgent and defended, shows its changing seams when watched carefully enough in the afternoon light. Some would continue walking meditation along shaded paths. Back and forth, feet touching earth with deliberate awareness. Others might sit in small gatherings to hear instruction from a respected elder. The words need not have been ornate to be transformative. A reminder about mindfulness of the body, a reflection on craving, a caution against conceit, an encouragement to persevere, a question asked sincerely, a pause held long enough for understanding to ripen inwardly, rather than merely being agreed with outwardly. Nearby, perhaps, a robe still fluttered from a branch in the soft wind, and the river's murmur entered the spaces between spoken lines. This was a human community, and therefore not free from friction, There would have been differences in temperament. One practitioner diligent and composed, another easily discouraged. One elder patient, another stern. One novice eager to please, another still carrying traces of pride from life before ordination. There might be embarrassment over mistakes, quiet comparisons, efforts to hide confusion, relief at being understood, gratitude for kindness that came without display. To imagine the Sangha as a gathering of perfected beings would be to miss the courage of what it truly was. People willing to be shaped. People willing to have roughness revealed. People willing again and again to return to training. Toward evening, when the harsher brightness had softened and shadows lengthened under the trees, the atmosphere would change once more. Birds settled. Smoke from cooking fires in nearby settlements drifted faintly through the air. The day's heat slowly released its hold. This was an hour that could carry both tiredness and peace. The body, after walking, sitting, working, and enduring weather, might feel heavy. The mind might review the day with mixed results. Was there mindfulness? Was there distraction? Had speech been restrained? Had irritation been seen clearly or fed secretly? There is humility in such questions. They keep the path close to life. Then would come recitation, that beautiful weaving of memory, devotion, and discipline. Voices together in the fading light, not raised in spectacle, but steadied by repetition. Suttas remembered line by line. Formulas of refuge, verses of guidance. The sound of human voices meeting in shared rhythm, while the river continued its own long chant beyond them. Evening recitations near the Ganges must have had a special tenderness. The water did not join in, and yet it seemed to accompany everything, as though nature itself were holding the outer edge of the silence into which the words eventually fell. After the recitations, stillness deepened. Some would remain seated beneath trees or in simple shelters, letting the teachings settle where language could no longer carry them. Night insects began their own small music. The scent of cooling earth rose more clearly. Far off, perhaps, a dog barked in a village, or an oar tapped wood against the side of a boat. Yet for long stretches there may have been almost nothing to disturb the great soft presence of evening. In such hours, inward quiet was not always dramatic. Sometimes it came as relief from the endless need to become someone. Sometimes it came as a widening around sorrow. Sometimes it came only for a few breaths, delicate and unmistakable. And what a mercy those breaths must have been for those who had struggled all day with the mind's turbulence. A monk who had spent the afternoon wrestling with resentment might suddenly feel it loosen, not because he forced it away, but because he stopped feeding it. A nun carrying an old grief might sit beside the river's sound and sense. For one unguarded moment, that sorrow too could be held in awareness, without swallowing the whole heart. Another might feel no insight at all, only fatigue, and even that fatigue, accepted without complaint, could become part of the training. Not every evening brought clarity, but every evening offered the chance to sit inside truth a little more gently than before. So the communities near the Ganges lived not in some unreachable purity, but in intimacy with effort. Their holiness, if we may call it that, was not polished perfection. It was continuity. It was the willingness to wash the robe again, walk the path again, receive what was offered again, examine the mind again, begin again. The river, always moving yet always itself, became a faithful companion to that labor. It taught without speaking. It reminded without insisting. It gave music to solitude and measure to time. Beside it, human beings practiced being less deceived by what rises and passes within them. And perhaps that is why these riverside scenes still feel close to us now. We know weariness. We know the relief of a simple meal. We know the embarrassment of our own unfinished hearts. We know what it is to long for quiet and then find, when quiet comes, that the mind is full of noise. The monks and nuns of that earlier age were not strangers to these things. They were people who placed themselves beside a current and listened long enough to learn from it. They were shaped by discipline, but also by weather, hunger, community, and the slow, honest labor of seeing clearly. As darkness gathered over the banks, and the Ganges carried moonlight in trembling fragments across its surface, the Sangha would settle into the night, each practitioner held between the vastness of the world and the small, steady duty of awakening. And beyond those groves and resting places, beyond the edge of monastic quiet, lay another field of human life entirely. Yet the Buddha's path was never only for monasteries, and the river carried his words into households where love and loss lived side by side. Beyond those groves and resting places, the teaching entered courtyards, kitchens, workshops, ferry landings, and sleeping mats spread near open doors where the night air could pass through. Along the Ganges, life in a household was never far from the sound of water. Even when the river could not be seen from every home, it made itself known in the smell of damp earth at dawn, in the cries of boatmen before sunrise, in the fine silt that clung to ankles, in the trade it carried, and in the fear it awakened during flood season. Families lived close to one another and close to necessity. A father might rise before first light to check a net or load grain onto a cart. A mother might wake while the stars were still visible to grind grain, stir the morning fire, and listen for the cough of a child in the dark. Grandparents sat with old memories and aching joints. Children chased one another through dust and reeds, laughing 1 hour and weeping the next. Servants swept thresholds, hauled water, pounded rice, cleaned vessels, and moved through the house with a quiet attention that was rarely praised, though the whole order of domestic life rested partly in their hands. These were not lives arranged for contemplation, and yet contemplation found them. It found them in pauses too small to be noticed by anyone else. A woman rinsing lentils at the water's edge might remember a teaching she had once overheard while delivering food to wandering mendicants, that the mind, if left untended, runs toward craving and irritation as easily as water runs downhill. A potter shaping clay beside a shaded wall might think of how a vessel remains fragile even when it appears finished, and how every fired bowl carries within it the possibility of breaking. An old man whose hearing had begun to fade might sit in the evening and reflect, not with bitterness but with quiet astonishment, on how the body changes whether one welcomes the change or not. The Buddha's words did not belong only to those who left home. For many who lived beside the Ganges, those words became most meaningful precisely because they could not leave. They had parents to care for, debts to repay, fields to tend, infants to feed, marriages to protect, and duties that returned each day like the sun. The path within a household looked different. It did not always unfold in long silences beneath trees. Sometimes it appeared in the moment before speaking sharply. Sometimes it was no more than a hand withdrawing from anger, a bowl of rice shared when supplies were low, a patient answer given to someone who had asked the same fearful question 3 times that day. In one home near the riverbank, a mother might be preparing the evening meal while 2 children quarrel over a palm leaf toy. One child accuses, the other strikes, both cry, and the room fills with that familiar storm made of hunger, fatigue, and wounded pride. She feels irritation rise quickly in her own chest. The day has been long, the rice is not enough. Her back aches. A younger child has had fever since noon. It would be easy to answer harshness with harshness. Yet somewhere in her memory lives the sound of a monk speaking in the village square about how anger, once fed, burns the one who carries it, so she pauses. Just for a breath, only a breath. But in that brief space, another response becomes possible. Her voice softens. She separates the children, gives each a task, and speaks of taking turns. The conflict does not become holy. No one is transformed into a sage. One child still sulks, the other still complains, but suffering does not spread as far as it might have. This too is part of the teaching entering the world. A father returning from market with less money than he hoped may walk home rehearsing his disappointment. Prices have shifted. A trader from another town brought finer cloth. A promised payment did not come. He is tired and ashamed, and shame often searches for a smaller target. The household can feel that before he even speaks. Yet perhaps he has also heard that clinging to gain and fearing loss tie the heart in knots. So before stepping through the doorway, he stands a moment under the fading light and listens to the river. Moving beyond the tamarind trees, he cannot command fortune. He cannot prevent all hardship, but he can choose not to pour the bitterness of the day into the laps of those waiting for him. When he enters, his face is still lined with worry, but he sits with the family and shares honestly what has happened. The meal is simple, the future is uncertain. Still, truth spoken gently becomes its own form of shelter. Elders in these households often carried another kind of knowledge. They had seen births and funerals, marriages and quarrels, harvests and failed rains. They knew how quickly beauty changes shape. A grandmother oiling her granddaughter's hair in the doorway at dusk may feel tenderness mixed with sorrow, because the soft black hair in her fingers recalls her own youth, now far away. She may remember the days when she moved quickly, when men listened more readily, when she could carry water without pain. The young girl before her cannot yet understand this hidden ache, the ache of being both present and already partly vanished from the world that values vigor. And yet old age itself became, for many, a teacher sharper than philosophy. Wrinkling skin, weakened sight, trembling hands, missing teeth, the body's slow surrender of certainty. These made impermanence impossible to dismiss. When the Buddha spoke of change, elders did not need persuasion. They felt it each morning when they rose. Children, too, met the truth early, though not through doctrine. They met it when a pet bird disappeared, when a monsoon swept away a toy boat, when a friend fell sick and did not return to play. They learned that adults could not protect them from every loss. Along the Ganges, a child might spend the afternoon chasing dragonflies through reeds, and by nightfall hear hushed voices around a sickbed. The world was tender and unstable at once. If a household had come to respect the teachings, children might hear simple guidance shaped for their understanding. Be kind to your sister, speak truth, do not mock the lame dog, offer water to the guest, notice how flowers open and fade. Such lessons were modest, but they planted seeds. The Dhamma in family life was often carried less by discourse than by repetition, example, and tone. Artisans and laborers living near the river found their own reflections in the Buddha's teaching. A weaver knew that a strong cloth came from many fine threads crossing in patience. A carpenter understood that haste could split the wood. A boatman knew the danger of fighting a current stronger than his arms. A washerman watched stains lift slowly, not all at once. A woman who dyed cloth might see how one color takes only when the fabric has been prepared well. So too with the heart. These ordinary labors gave shape to inner understanding. People who spent their days making, mending, carrying, measuring, scrubbing, and bargaining were not outside the spiritual life. They were in the very middle of it, because they lived where intention became action over and over again. Servants, too, heard and felt the teachings, often in conditions of vulnerability, that made them especially piercing. A servant girl in a prosperous household might eat last, sleep lightly, and endure commands given without gratitude. She would know the sharp difference between those who held power and those who depended on mercy. If she heard that every being fears pain, that cruelty leaves a mark on the mind, and that generosity ennobles both giver and receiver, such words would not be abstract. They would touch the sore places of daily life. They might also touch the conscience of those she served. A mistress of the house, once moved by the Buddha's teaching, might begin to notice the personhood of the woman who washed her children's clothes and carried her messages. Perhaps she offers better food, or a moment to rest, or speaks a name instead of a command. Such gestures seem small against the weight of social order. Yet for the one receiving them, they can feel like sunlight entering a narrow room. There was, in one such village, a woman known simply as the herb gatherer, who walked the marshy edges of the Ganges before sunrise to collect roots, bark, and bitter leaves that eased fever, calmed coughing children, and settled the stomachs of the old. She had no wealth and no rank, only a worn cloth bag and hands stained green from years of careful work. People came to her door at strange hours, sometimes weeping, sometimes silent with worry, and she rarely turned anyone away, even when payment was only a promise or a handful of grain. Once, a traveling monk rested near her hut during the rains, and spoke of how compassion need not announce itself with ceremony, how a life spent easing the suffering of strangers was itself a kind of practice, quiet and unglamorous, much like tending a garden no one praises. The herb gatherer listened without interrupting, then returned to her work the next morning as she always had, grinding roots by the river's edge, while mist still clung to the reeds. She did not call what she did a teaching. She called it simply helping where help was needed. Yet those who knew her sensed that her steadiness, her patience with the frightened and the ill, carried something of the same spirit the wandering teachers spoke of beneath the trees. Years later, when she herself grew too weak to gather roots, the daughters and granddaughters of those she had treated came to sit with her, bringing broth, washing her feet, repeating back to her the small kindnesses she had once given so freely. The river that had watched her walk its banks for decades now watched her rest beside it, and villagers said that even in her stillness she seemed to be teaching something about the quiet dignity of a life spent tending to others. Grief was never far from these homes. The river gave life and took it. Illness arrived without warning. A fever could carry off a child in days. A difficult birth could leave a husband stunned beside a mat where joy and terror had just struggled together. An aging parent might weaken slowly, becoming more absent while still alive. Families knew the helplessness of watching breath grow shallow. They knew the silence after wailing. They knew the way ordinary objects remain after death, with an almost unbearable innocence. A cup, a shawl, a wooden comb, a sleeping place no one wants to fold away. For such people, the Buddha's words were not merely clever truths. They were medicine, though not the kind that erased pain. When he spoke of separation from what is loved, households along the Ganges recognized themselves. When he spoke of the body's vulnerability, they thought of their own sick rooms. When he taught that clinging cannot prevent change, some may have resisted the teaching at first, because grief always wants one more hour, one more touch, one more impossible return. But over time, the teaching could settle into sorrow not as coldness, but as mercy. It allowed mourners to stop arguing with what had already happened. It gave them a way to love without pretending they could hold forever. Economic hardship also made the teachings intimate. A failed crop, a broken axle, a flooded storehouse, an animal lost, an unjust levy, a debt that grew faster than repayment, were enough to turn sleep thin and conversation tense. Poverty narrows the horizon. It can make the heart contract around fear. Under such pressure, generosity may seem foolish. Yet this was exactly where generosity revealed its depth, not in abundance alone, but in scarcity. A handful of grain shared with a neighbor, a lamp lit for someone returning late, a place on the floor offered to a traveler, a child taught to give the better portion to an elder. Such acts did not solve structural hardship. Still, they preserved something precious from being swallowed by desperation. They kept the human heart from hardening completely. At evening, when work slowed and the sky turned copper, households by the Ganges entered a different rhythm. Lamps were lit one by one. Smoke from cooking fires lifted into the dimming air. The river breeze moved through reed mats and half-open shutters, cooling foreheads damp from the day. Somewhere a baby fussed and was rocked. Somewhere an elder recited an old story from memory. Somewhere a wife and husband, too tired for argument, sat in companionable silence and listened to insects beginning their night song. The light of an oil lamp on a clay wall could make even a poor dwelling seem briefly tender, as if the whole house were cupped in a patient hand. In such hours, private reflection came more easily. A man might remember a cruel remark and regret it. A woman might sit beside a sleeping child and feel the fragile sweetness of what cannot be kept. An old servant might massage his own knees and wonder how many more seasons of labor remain. A daughter caring for an ill mother might watch the lamp flame tremble and understand, without words, that all lives do the same. The teaching did not have to arrive in formal language. Sometimes it came as a recognition that this moment is passing, sometimes as gratitude, sometimes as forgiveness finally loosening after many days, sometimes as the simple resolve to cause a little less harm tomorrow. This was how the Buddha's path lived among householders by the river, not apart from affection but within it, not free from worry but quietly reshaping the way worry was carried, not by removing grief, aging, illness, or uncertainty, but by helping ordinary people meet them with a little more steadiness, a little more tenderness, a little less illusion. Beside the Ganges, in homes made of timber, clay, woven mats, hope, fatigue, memory, and devotion, awakening was not always a distant mountain. Sometimes it was a lamp protected from the wind by careful hands. As day slips toward night again, the river becomes a mirror for the one truth that touched every palace, hut, grove, and boat alike. The Ganges does not keep a single shape for more than a breath. One moment its skin is bronze beneath the last of the sun, and the next darks into blue, then charcoal, then a trembling black that catches pieces of moonlight and lets them go. A ripple forms and disappears. A current folds over itself and is gone. Reflections gather, break apart, and gather again in another pattern. No hand can smooth the water and ask it to remain as it is. No eye can find one lasting surface and say, "This is the river." So it was for those who lived beside it in the Buddha's time, whether they understood it clearly or only felt it wordlessly in the chest. The child racing barefoot along the bank could not stay a child. The mother bending to wash rice at dawn would not always have quick hands and an untroubled back. The ferryman strong enough to pull a loaded boat against the current would one day pause to catch his breath. Then, one day watch younger arms do what his own once did without effort. The merchant proud of his fine cloth would see colors fade in the market's sun. The jasmine wound into a bride's hair would grow limp before morning. Even the stories people told of themselves, so carefully repeated, shifted with each season like wet sand under the water's edge. The Buddha asked people to look closely at this, not to become cold, and not to sink into despair, but to stop asking from changing things what changing things could never give. To expect permanence from what is woven of conditions is to press the heart against a door that will not open. Yet many did this without knowing. They looked at a young face and silently begged it, "Stay." They held a season of health and whispered, "Remain." They sat with a beloved friend while evening birds called across the reeds. And in some hidden chamber of the mind came the impossible wish, "Let this never end." The river answered such wishes gently, and always in the same way. It moved on. If one sat quietly enough on the bank, the lesson could be heard without words. Water touched a stone and moved around it. Leaves drifted from upstream and vanished into dark. A garland released after prayer spun in a small circle, then slipped away into the broader current. Even the stars above, which seemed so fixed to human eyes, crossed the sky and disappeared beyond the western trees. Nothing remained exactly as it had been. Nothing stood still, long enough to become a secure refuge for longing. And yet there was no violence in the river's honesty. It did not mock those who grieved change. It did not rush to teach, simply showed what had always been true. What is born will alter, what is gathered will scatter, what is built will weather, what is loved will pass through forms the heart cannot control. The body softens, tightens, blooms, aches, weakens, hair darkens, then threads with silver, then thins, teeth loosen, sleep changes, appetite changes. The things once carried easily become heavy. The road once walked in an afternoon takes a whole day with pauses beneath shade. In the villages along the Ganges, old age was never hidden far from sight. Children saw it in bent grandparents warming themselves in the morning light. They saw it in fingers knotted by labor, in eyes clouded by years of sun and dust, in the slow lowering of a body onto a mat at day's end. Youth and age were not separate worlds. One flowed toward the other as surely as rainwater finds the river. A laughing boy, all speed and hunger and shining skin, already carried within him the future stoop of the spine, the trembling hand, the need for a grandson to guide him across uneven ground. And the old woman whose face had become fine as dry leaves still carried traces of the girl she had once been, though no one could summon that vanished face back into the light. This, too, was impermanence, not a punishment, not a mistake in the order of things, but the nature of all compounded life. Meetings also rose and faded like eddies on the current. Traders arrived with bright speech and departed before dawn. Monks rested beneath a grove for one rain season, then moved onward when the roads cleared. A child made a friend from another village during a festival and never saw him again. Brothers quarreled and left the same doorway by different roads. Lovers who once thought no evening could be complete without each other's voice learned, in time, the silence of absence. Some partings came with warning, some came with none. A fever in the night, a car broken on a distant road, a storm, a king's command, a change in fortune, and the shape of a household was altered. How tenderly people tried to hold one another against this truth. They saved a piece of cloth because a father had worn it. They remembered the exact way a daughter laughed with water in her mouth. They repeated the advice of the dead as though sound itself might continue a life. They returned to favorite places and felt the ache of how the same tree, the same landing, the same turn in the path could not restore the same hour. Even when reunion came, it did not arrive untouched. The traveler who returned was changed. The one who waited was changed. Joy met joy, but never in exactly the old form. There is a quiet sorrow in this. The Buddha did not deny it. To see impermanence clearly is not to become incapable of tears. It is to understand why tears come. Because the heart loves. Because it leans toward continuity. Because it knows beauty and cannot help but feel the trembling of beauty's passing. A lotus opens, and already it is on its way to closing. Incense is lit, and already the fragrance is thinning into air. Rice cooks, is shared, is eaten, is gone. A song rises over evening water, and while it is still being sung, it is already slipping into memory. But impermanence is not cruelty alone. This was one of the deeper mercies hidden in the Buddha's teaching, and perhaps one of the hardest to trust at first. If everything were fixed, how could sorrow ever soften? If nothing changed, how could pain heal, anger cool, confusion clear, or fear loosen its hard grip? If a harsh word could never be outgrown, if a mistake could never be redeemed, if a season of poverty could never give way to relief, then the world would be far more merciless than it is. The same law that takes youth into age also carries despair toward unexpected peace. The same movement that scatters also makes renewal possible. A muddy stretch of water settles by morning. A wound closes little by little under a clean bandage. A widow who thought she would never again hear herself laugh one day does, startled by the sound. A man long ruled by greed grows gentler after loss reveals the poverty of his grasping. A frightened child becomes a patient elder. A hard heart, if tended with truth, can open. Conditions change. This is why awakening is possible at all. Without the stone, liberation could never happen. But the mind, like the river, is moving, influenceable, capable of being guided. Still, because life passes, tenderness matters. In a world where nothing can be kept forever, each act of care becomes more precious, not less. A bowl of water offered to a traveler, a mother smoothing a sleeping child's hair, a husband setting aside the ripest fruit for his wife without speaking of it, a novice monk receiving instruction while the lamp burns low, a daughter listening one more time to an elder's story, though she has heard it many times before. Such moments shine because they cannot be stored. They must be lived when they appear. Their fragility is part of their sweetness. The people by the Ganges may not have used grand words for this as they cooked, mended nets, stacked firewood, or waited out monsoon rain, but many must have known it in their bones. Quarrels left too long might never be mended. Gratitude postponed might never be spoken. A hand not taken today might be absent tomorrow. So kindness was not merely a virtue shining in the distance. It was practical wisdom in a fleeting world, to be gentle now, to forgive while both are still breathing, to look fully at the face before you, because time is carrying it onward even as you gaze. And this is why the Buddha's insight did not ask people to turn away from life in disgust. It invited them to love more truthfully. Not with the desperate grip that says, "Be mine, stay unchanged, do not move," but with the wiser warmth that says, "You are here now, and this is wondrous, you are passing, and so am I, and therefore let me meet you with care. Let me not waste this brief crossing in resentment, vanity, or sleepwalking desire. Let me wake up before the lamp goes out." To see impermanence deeply is also to feel a noble urgency. Not panic, not frantic striving, but a clear remembering that this human life does not linger forever. Nights are spent and do not return. Breaths leave and do not come back as the same breaths. Seasons turn, the strong body weakens, the distracted mind can spend years wandering and call it living. So the wise do not postpone the work of understanding endlessly. They do not assume there will always be another year to soften pride, another month to practice generosity, another day to sit quietly and look into the mind's restless habits. The current is moving whether one watches or not. Yet this urgency in the Buddha's way can be soft. It can feel like a lantern lifted in darkness rather than a shout in the ear. You may sense it now as you imagine the river at night, broad and patient under the stars. Nothing in its movement is hurried, and still it never ceases. So too, with life we need not be harsh with ourselves to recognize that time is passing. We need only become honest. Honest about the body, honest about the mind, honest about the people we love, honest about the fact that every meeting is touched by eventual parting, and every joy, however pure, carries within it the delicate shadow of change. This does not make joy less beautiful, it makes it more intimate. A child asleep with one hand open on the mat, the scent of wet earth after evening rain, the murmur of distant chanting crossing the water, the first cool breeze after a hot day, the sound of someone returning safely at last. These things do not last, and because they do not last, they ask for our presence rather than our possession. To truly receive them, one must stop trying to trap them. Perhaps that is why the dark river could soothe those who listened to it long enough. It offered no false promise, yet it did not withhold peace. It said, in its ceaseless whisper, "Let go a little." Not of love, but of the demand that love defeat time. Not of beauty, but of the wish to freeze beauty in place. Not of life, but of the dream that life can be secured by clinging. The water moved, and in moving it taught release. The banks eroded, reeds bent, moonlight trembled, and still there was a profound calm in seeing things as they are. There, beside the Ganges in the Buddha's age, under a sky slowly filling with stars, a person might have felt this truth settle not only into thought, but into the body itself, the jaw unclenching. the breath lengthening, the hands resting more easily in the lap. Change was everywhere, yes, but once seen clearly, it no longer need to be fought every moment. It could be grieved where grief was natural, honored where love was deep, and accepted where wisdom had begun to grow. And once the heart begins to see change clearly, compassion starts to rise as naturally as moonlight on water. It did not always arrive as a revelation. More often, in the Buddha's time, along the long breathing edge of the Ganges, compassion appeared in forms so ordinary that many might have missed their radiance if they were looking only for miracles. It lived in the way a clay bowl was filled a little more generously when a stranger came hungry at dusk. It lived in the pause someone made on a crowded set of river steps, turning back to offer an elbow to an old man whose legs shook with effort. It lived in the quiet instinct to make room beneath a roof when rain began to fall, and a traveler, dust-covered and weary, stood uncertain at the threshold. The river carried merchants, mendicants, farmers, grieving mothers, messengers, children, monks, and those who belonged nowhere in particular. It gathered the lives of many kinds of people into one moving world. At the ferry landings, where ropes creaked and boats knocked softly against wood, people stood close enough to hear one another cough, sigh, pray, bargain, laugh. No one remained only an idea there. Need a face, fatigue had a posture, sorrow had a sound, and because of that closeness, the opportunity for kindness was always near. Imagine the first pale light of morning spreading over the water. Mist still lingers low, and on the steps women descend with pots balanced against their hips. A child runs ahead, then stops when he sees an elderly widow trying to steady herself on the worn stone. Without ceremony, he reaches for her hand. It is not a perfect gesture. His fingers are small and he pulls too quickly, but she smiles, and together they move down the steps. Nearby, another woman notices a man with an injured foot standing apart, waiting for others to finish before he attempts the descent. She shifts her own errand without complaint, helps him carry his vessel, and waits while he fills it. Nothing about the scene is grand, no one records it. Yet in such moments the world becomes a little less harsh. By midday the kitchens are warm with fire and grain, lentils simmer, rice is rinsed and poured into blackened pots. Flat cakes are pressed by patient hands. In homes near the river, there were always calculations to be made. How much food remained, whether the harvest would hold, how many mouths would return by evening. People in every age know the caution that lives beside hunger. And still, even where life was uncertain, a portion was often set aside for a wandering ascetic, for a laborer who had earned too little, for a widow with children, for someone recovering from fever who could not cook for themselves. This was not abundance without limit. It was generosity shaped by human reality. A woman might scrape the last of the spiced vegetables from the side of a pot and add water to make enough for one more serving. A household might spread mats a little tighter at night so that a traveler could sleep inside instead of under open sky. Someone with only coarse cloth to offer might fold it carefully for a sick neighbor and apologize that it was not softer. Compassion was not kept pure by distance. It entered smoke-dark kitchens, touched cracked hands, and worked with what was available. Along dusty roads beside the Ganges, where ox carts groaned and sandals gathered heat, travelers often moved under more than the burden of their bundles. Some carried news of illness waiting at home, some carried debts, some carried loneliness so familiar it had become almost invisible. To offer shade to such a person, even for a short while, was no small thing. Beneath a neem tree or beside the wall of a rest house, one person might pour another a cup of water and ask no intrusive questions. Just sit and drink. Rest before you go on. Sometimes mercy was exactly that simple. There were those whose suffering could not be hidden. A body thinned by fever, eyes clouded with pain, skin marked by disease. In many times and places, the sick are feared not only because of contagion, but because they remind others of fragility. Yet in the world touched by the Buddha's teaching, another possibility had begun to deepen. To care for the sick was not merely an obligation of family. It could become a practice of awakening itself. To wash the forehead of someone burning with heat, to change their cloth, to carry them broth, to clean what was unpleasant to clean. These acts trained the heart away from aversion and toward truth. This body is vulnerable. That body is vulnerable. There is no lasting wall between us. In monasteries shaded by groves, monks learned that lofty speech meant little if compassion did not bend down to meet actual need. The teachings were profound, yes. They spoke of suffering, of its causes, of release beyond grasping. But those truths were not meant to float above daily life like distant stars. They had to enter the bowl in the hand, the footpath under dust, the infirmary mat, the shared silence beside someone who had no words, left. A monk who could recite discourses but recoil from an ill companion had missed something essential. A layperson who listened attentively to teachings and then returned home to strike a servant or ignore a starving animal had not yet let wisdom take root. Again and again, the Buddha pointed toward a freedom that was not cold, not sealed away from the world, not won by hardening oneself against the cries of others. True liberation could not be separated from compassion, because the illusion of separateness itself was one of the deepest causes of suffering. When one sees clearly that all beings fear pain, seek safety, cling to life, and tremble before loss, the heart softens not out of sentimentality, but out of understanding. The hand opens because wisdom has begun to open it. So compassion along the Ganges was not only an emotion. It was a way of moving through the day. It was practical. It knew how to lift, carry, share, wait, listen, and tend. It did not require wealth, education, or status. A ferryman could practice it by taking extra care with a frail passenger stepping into the boat. A girl could practice it by saving the ripest guava for her grandmother. A potter could practice it by mending a cracked water jar for a family who could not pay at once. A herdsman could practice it by guiding thirsty animals first to the shallower bank. A monk could practice it by sitting beside a frightened novice through the night. Small deeds, each one brief, together changed the moral temperature of the world. And perhaps that was part of the quiet holiness of that age. Sanctity did not belong only to forests of meditation, or to moments of deep insight beneath still trees. It also appeared in the marketplace, when a seller noticed a customer counting coins twice, and quietly removed one item from the scale. It appeared when a boatman delayed departure for a woman carrying a sleeping child. It appeared when neighbors, hearing that a birth had gone badly, arrived not to stare or advise, but to sweep the floor, boil water, and keep the older children fed. The sacred was woven through ordinary gentleness, so familiar that it might pass unnoticed except by the one receiving it, and by the inward stillness of the one offering it. On evenings when the river turned copper under the setting sun, villagers and travelers alike might gather near shrines, rest houses, or monastery walls. Stories would be exchanged, rice would be ladled into bowls. Someone would speak of a teaching they had heard from a Magar monk who traveled from Kosala, or from Magadha, or from a grove where the Buddha had once stayed. And if the teaching was understood well, it did not leave people dazzled so much as altered in the simplest of ways. They might return home more patient with a difficult parent, more tender with a sick child, less eager to mock the slow, the poor, the strange, or the inconvenient. A real teaching changed the use of the hands. There is something deeply comforting in this. Many hearts quietly wonder whether goodness must be dramatic to matter, whether only the rare shining act truly counts. But along the Ganges in the Buddha's time, as in any time, most suffering was relieved not by spectacle but by steady mercy, by someone remembering to bring warm water, by someone noticing silence and asking gently, "Are you well?" by someone stepping into the heat of another's burden for a few steps of the road. These things did not erase sickness, old age, grief, or death. They did something humbler and, in its own way, more holy. They made suffering less lonely, and loneliness, perhaps, is one of the heaviest burdens human beings carry. To be ill and untended, to be old and hurried, to be poor and regarded as a nuisance, to be grieving and met with avoidance. Compassion interrupted that abandonment. It said, without needing many words, "You are not outside the circle of care. Your pain has not made you unworthy. Your weakness has not cancelled your dignity." In a world where so much could be lost overnight, health, security, family, harvest, youth, such recognition was no small gift. It restored something invisible but vital. Even animals, too, entered this widening field of concern. At the river's edge, a boy might free a calf tangled in reeds. A woman washing clothes might scatter a little grain for birds pecking near the bank. Monastics, trained to walk with care, would watch where they stepped after rain, mindful of living creatures beneath their feet. Compassion, when nourished by the Buddha's vision, did not stop neatly at the boundary of one's own kin or caste or usefulness. It leaned outward. It questioned old habits of indifference. It asked the heart to grow large enough to include the trembling life in all forms. This did not mean people became perfect. They still lost their tempers. They still withheld, judged, envied, and feared. Compassion was not the constant atmosphere of every village and every household. It had to be remembered, chosen, practiced again. Some days it came easily. Some days resentment was stronger. Some days narrowed the heart. Yet that is precisely what made these acts meaningful. They were not automatic. They were victories of tenderness over habit, of awareness over self-absorption, of shared humanity over the old reflex to turn away. If you had walked then beside the Ganges, at twilight your evening birds settle, and the last voices drift from the ferry, you might have sensed that the spiritual life was not somewhere else, not hidden only in remote caves or in the speech of the wise, but alive wherever one being met another with care. The path toward freedom was being traced in humble places, on damp steps, in steaming kitchens, under patched roofs, beside rough sleeping mats, at the edge of fever and fatigue and need. Compassion was not an ornament to truth. It was one of truth's most human faces, and so the river remembered not only kings and caravans, not only teachings spoken under trees, not only cities rising and fading on its banks. It also held the memory of simple mercies, the shared meal, the offered hand, the shade seat, the patient washing of a sick body, the unspoken kindness that preserved another's dignity. These were quiet currents running through the Buddha's world, as real as trade winds and monsoon rains. They taught that awakening was not merely a matter of what one understood in the mind, but of what one allowed the heart to do in the presence of another's need. From these small circles of warmth along the water's edge, the world of the Ganges begins to widen, and the story turns toward those whose influence reached farther: the rulers, the householders of great means, and the generous patrons whose lives, too, were shaped by the river's patient flow. Along the broad and life-giving course of the Ganges, power gathered as surely as silt. Where the river bent near fertile plains and busy roads, cities rose with confidence. Their gates opened at dawn to caravans, tax collectors, herdsmen, monks, farmers, and messengers carrying news from one court to another. Boats arrived heavy with grain, timber, salt, cloth, oil, and jars sealed with wax. The smell of wet earth mixed smoke from cook fires, sandalwood from shrines, and the sharper scent of animals pressed into narrow streets. Here, in these riverfront centers, wealth did not hide. It announced itself in carved balconies, storerooms full of goods, polished chariots, guarded walls, and the measured pace of men who had servants walking a half step behind. Behind outer roads and crowded markets stood compounds protected by gates and watchful guards. Some belonged to rulers, some to powerful officials, some to merchant families whose fortunes had been made not by conquest, but by careful exchange. Their courtyards were swept clean, their granaries were high, their wells were lined with stone. In audience halls, pillars held up shaded roofs, beneath which decisions were made that could bless a village or burden it for years. There kings listened to petitions, weighed alliances, received envoys, and measured the moods of neighboring realms. There, disputes over land, trade, inheritance, and honor were spoken aloud in formal voices, while quieter calculations moved under every word. The river was never far from these places. Even when hidden behind walls, it remained present in the coolness of the morning air, in the barges that brought revenue, in the fields fed by its waters, in the very grain piled in storehouses. The abundance of the land helped sustain courts and merchant houses alike. Rice fields, orchards, and grazing lands gave shape to prosperity. Trade routes braided the region together, and the Ganges was one of the great threads in that braid. It carried goods, people, rumor, ambition, and hope. A city beside such a river could imagine itself secure. It could believe that strength had foundations. And yet, within those guarded places, fear lived as faithfully as comfort did. A king might sit on a raised seat, his voice obeyed before it fully left his mouth. But even he could not command certainty. He knew too much of how power changed hands. He knew how quickly loyalty could cool, how easily a friend could become a rival, how one poor harvest could sharpen tempers across an entire province. He knew that borders were not lines in the earth so much as agreements constantly tested by desire. News from upriver could disturb a meal. A rumor from a neighboring court could darken an evening. A son might be beloved and still become impatient. A minister might bow deeply and still conceal a private scheme. The ornaments of authority were visible. The insecurity beneath them often remained hidden, carried alone like a stone in the chest. In the houses of the wealthy, another kind of unease moved quietly through polished rooms. Merchant fortunes depended on caravans arriving safely, on roads remaining passable, on river levels being neither too low nor too wild, on agreements holding, on theft staying at a distance, on the health of sons, the wisdom of daughters' marriages, the trustworthiness of partners, the honesty of stewards, the fairness of taxes, the mood of rulers, the strength of cattle, the timing of rains. Wealth gave choices, but it did not remove vulnerability. In some ways, it multiplied it. The more one owned, the more there was to protect. The more carefully one had built a name, the more one feared disgrace. The more hated comfort, the more one trembled before the thought of losing it. This was part of the human field into which the Buddha spoke. When he taught about change, he was not speaking only to the poor, only to wanderers, only to those whose suffering was obvious to the eye. He was also speaking to those clothed in fine fabric, sleeping on soft bedding, eating from full kitchens, and giving commands with ease. He spoke into a world where privilege and danger sat close together. A palace might shine in the afternoon sun, but sickness could enter it without asking permission. A wealthy man could purchase land, hire workers, expand his trade, and still lie awake before dawn haunted by a question no servant could answer. How can I keep what must one day leave me? A mother in a noble household could love her child no less fiercely than a mother in a reed hut, and no wealth could make that child immune to fever. Gold could delay certain hardships, soften certain blows, command labor, summon doctors, and secure protection. It could not bargain with old age. It could not bribe death. It could not guarantee peace inside the heart. Perhaps this is why some among the powerful turned, in one way or another, towards spiritual communities. Their reasons were not all the same. Human motives rarely are. Some sought merit, hoping that generosity in this life would bear fruit beyond what the eye could see. Some sought moral standing, understanding that patronage of renunciants, shrines, and places of teaching could strengthen a ruler's image as just and wise. Some gave because they genuinely admired discipline, clarity, and compassion wherever they found them. Some were weary of intrigue and found relief in the company of those who had stepped away from competition. Some came with questions they would never dare ask in court. Some came only out of curiosity and found themselves changed by what they heard. In the Buddha's time, support from rulers and prosperous householders helped create conditions in which the teachings could endure in lived form. Monastic communities needed robes, arms, shelter during the rains, medicine when illness came, and safe places where teachings could be heard and remembered. Such support did not erase the simplicity of the path. Rather, it revealed how deeply interwoven society was. The renunciant depended on the householder for food. The householder depended on the renunciant for a reminder that life was larger than acquisition and fear. Between them moved an exchange more subtle than commerce. One offered material support, the other offered a way of seeing. It is easy, from a distance, to imagine generosity as pure and uncomplicated, but in real life it often carried many currents at once. A ruler might endow a grove or protect a monastic residence from disturbance, partly from reverence, partly from prudence, partly from a wish to be remembered well. A merchant might give alms with a sincere heart, while also hoping to ease anxiety about the future. A noble family might invite teachers into their compound because they longed for wisdom, yet still take quiet pride in being known as benefactors. The Buddha's world was not divided into simple saints and simple worldlings. It was filled, as ours is, with layered intentions, with people moving toward goodness while still carrying vanity, fear, tenderness, ambition, and longing within them. And still something beautiful happened in that shared landscape. Even within structures shaped by rank, there were moments when the teachings entered and softened the hardened places of social life. A king who was praised all day might hear a few plain words about impermanence and feel, perhaps for a rare moment, the humility of being simply mortal. A wealthy donor might watch monks eat a modest meal in silence and recognize the restlessness of his own endless wanting. A queen surrounded by attendants might listen to a teaching on compassion and feel the hidden sorrow she had kept beneath ceremony. A court official, practiced in strategy, might hear that hatred does not cease by hatred and understand something truer than policy. The audience halls of that age must have held remarkable contrasts. On one side, ornaments, banners, polished floors, guards with weapons, men trained in formal address. On the other, perhaps, a wandering teacher in plain robes, carrying little, possessing nothing that looked powerful in worldly terms. And yet the words spoken from such simplicity could outlast decrees. They could follow a listener back into private chambers, into sleepless nights, into moments of anger, grief, or fatigue. Political commands could shape a day. Wisdom could shape a life. Even those accustomed to receiving homage may have felt, in the presence of deep truth, the strange relief of not having to perform greatness for a little while. Outside the compounds, the city continued in all its layered motion. Porters bent beneath loads, boatmen shouted across the docks, children ran barefoot past warehouses, scribes counted goods, laborers repaired walls, craftsmen hammered metal and turned wood, priests tended fires, dancers rehearsed for festival nights, beggars watched for kindness, farmers came in with produce, courtesans, physicians, sweepers, soldiers, widows, and wandering ascetics all moved through the same urban weave. The wealthy depended on this living network more than they often admitted. Splendor was never self-made. Every polished surface rested upon many unseen hands, and the river watched all of it with the same unhurried movement. It flowed past palace walls and poor dwellings without preference. It touched the bathing steps of nobles and the muddy banks where villagers washed their only cloth. It carried reflections of mansions, and reflections of broken fences with equal ease. The same water that glimmered beside a royal garden also darkened the soil where common people planted their food. If one listened closely enough, there was a teaching in that impartial flow. The river did not pause longer for the rich. It did not bend lower for the crowned. It did not withdraw from the lowly. It moved by all, beside all, nourishing and eroding alike, as if reminding every life it passed that conditions differ, but change spares no one. Perhaps that is why the image of the river belongs so naturally in a story about awakening. Human beings build names, households, dynasties, alliances, reputations. We stack certainty where we can. We guard entrances, we record ownership. We celebrate influence, yet, beneath all this, time is moving. The relationships are moving. The mind itself is moving from desire to satisfaction to boredom, to fear and back again. The Ganges in the Buddha's time must have seemed eternal to many who stood upon its banks, and yet even a river is never the same from one moment to the next. How much less stable, then, are the arrangements we cling to so tightly? This did not mean kingship was meaningless, or that wealth was evil in itself, or that patronage was empty. It meant only that none of these could serve as a final refuge. Good rule could reduce suffering. Generosity could nourish countless lives. Resources could create safety, learning, beauty, and leisure enough for deeper reflection. But no throne could silence the truth of mortality. No treasury could purchase liberation. No guarded compound could keep out the aging of the body or the wandering hunger of an untrained mind. The Buddha did not ask the powerful merely to feel guilty for what they possessed. He invited them, as he invited everyone, to see clearly what possession could and could not do. So in that age beside the Ganges, one can imagine a profound coexistence, grandeur and fragility, ceremony and doubt, public strength and private trembling, lavish gifts and restless nights, reverence offered in halls where intrigue still whispered in corners, human beings reaching upward through status while inwardly searching for ground that would not shift beneath them. Some found enough honesty to recognize that the deepest security could not be built from walls, armies, or accounts, but from understanding the nature of the heart itself. And beyond courts and commerce, the deepest crossings were often the silent ones taking place within a single mind. Along the Ganges, people crossed water every day. They stepped into ferries at dawn with rolled blankets under their arms, with baskets of grain, with jars sealed in wax, with children leaning sleepily against their sides. They crossed under the white light of morning, under the full heat of afternoon, under the copper hush of evening when the river held the sky in broken pieces. Oars dipped and rose, wet wood creaked. The current pressed against the hull, patient and tireless, as though reminding every traveler that movement was never entirely their own. Even the shortest crossing asked for a kind of surrender. One could step aboard, choose a place to sit, steady the breath, and wait. But no one commanded the river itself. It is easy to imagine how ordinary this must have seemed to those who lived there. A crossing was a crossing. One shore held a village, a market, a field, a monastery, a grove. The other held another road, another home, another duty waiting to be met. Feet got dusty. Clothes gathered the smell of water and reeds. Payment changed hands. A ferryman squinted into the sun and pushed away from the bank again. Life moved on, and yet, because human beings are what they are, even the most practical journey can begin to gather deeper meaning. A mother carrying an offering may stare into the moving water and feel that her own thoughts are just as restless. A merchant who has spent his life measuring profit may notice, in the middle of the river, how little follows him in that small rocking boat besides his own mind. A weary laborer may watch one bank recede and another come near, and feel, without knowing why, that he has done this many times within himself, leaving behind one mood only to arrive at another, leaving anger for relief, fear for courage, confusion for a brief and precious calm. The river made such reflections almost unavoidable. It showed change without argument. It held no shape for long. Light trembled across it and was gone. Ripples erased one another. Mud rose from below, clouded the edge, then slowly settled back into stillness. To stand before such water day after day was to be gently instructed by it, whether one sought instruction or not. Nothing stayed. Nothing could be grasped in the form one first saw. Even the bank beneath one's feet was being touched, worn, altered little by little. Perhaps this is one reason the image of crossing became so natural in the spiritual language of that time. The people who listened to the Buddha did not need a scholar to explain what it meant to go from one side to another. They knew the waiting. They knew the uncertainty of stepping onto an unsteady plank. They knew the moment of being neither here nor there, with water moving beneath them and no firm ground underfoot. They knew the relief of arrival, the slight surprise of touching land again, the body readjusting after motion. The metaphor lived already in their muscles. But the Buddha, with his quiet and radical clarity, turned that familiar image inward. The deepest crossing, he suggested, was not from this village to that one, not from one kingdom into the next, not even from wilderness into safety. It was a crossing from delusion toward seeing, from clinging toward release, from fear toward peace. The farther shore was not simply a place. It was a way of being no longer ruled by the storms of the heart. This was not always easy for people to hear, because the mind loves distance. It loves to imagine that what it seeks lies elsewhere, just beyond the next bend, on the opposite bank, in another house, another relationship, another season of life. A person could stand by the Ganges and think, if only I reach the other side, then I will feel settled. If only I enter that city, that sum, join that gathering, gain that blessing, then the unease within me will finally quiet down. And perhaps for a little while, the new shore did seem to promise relief. The road changed, the scenery changed, faces changed, duties changed, but the old confusion, if untouched, stepped ashore with the traveler. This is one of the tender truths in the Buddha's teaching. He did not say it to condemn the longing for change. He understood longing deeply. He understood how tired people become of their own suffering, how earnestly they search for somewhere cleaner, safer, more certain. But he invited them to look closely at what exactly must be crossed. Was it only water, only distance, only circumstance? Or was it attachment itself, the fist that closed around what could not remain, the illusion that said, this is mine, this is me, this must not change? Many people, no doubt, came to the river believing that freedom would be found on some literal farther shore, and in a way, that longing was not mistaken. The heart does know that another way of living is possible. It senses, even through its own confusion, that there is a peace not based on possession, a clarity not dependent on favorable weather, praise, or success. But the heart can mistake direction. It can turn outward toward endless rearrangement when the necessary movement is inward, quieter, more honest, and more difficult. Imagine a man sitting in a ferry as twilight gathers around him. He has argued with a brother. He has lost money. He has spoken sharply to someone he loves, and now feels the ache of his own words returning to him. He stares at the darkening water and tells himself that tomorrow he will begin again elsewhere, that a new agreement, a new road, a new chance will save him from this heaviness. Then the boat glides through a patch of calmer current, and for a single moment he is simply there, breathing, listening, no longer rehearsing the past or bargaining with the future. In that instant, small and almost invisible, another kind of crossing begins, not dramatic, not announced, just the faint softening of the mind's grip. Or imagine a woman who has spent years fearing loss because loss has already visited her. She boards with her bundle held tightly to her chest, not because of its value, but because holding tightly has become her habit, her shield against uncertainty. As the crossing continues, she watches children on the far bank, chasing one another through the reeds, hears laughter carried over the water, and feels tears rise for reasons she cannot name. Nothing outward has been solved. No one has returned to her. No promise has been made. Yet the sorrow, for one breath, is not an enemy. It is simply known, and in being known gently it changes. This too is a crossing. The Buddha's path often moves like this, not by force, not by theatrical transformation, but through seeing. Seeing craving as craving, seeing fear as fear, seeing the endless labor of trying to build permanence from what is passing. This kind of seeing is not cold. It is deeply compassionate, because it no longer asks the heart to pretend. It no longer demands that suffering be hidden beneath ritual, ambition, distraction, or pride. It lets a person sit in the middle of the river of experience and admit, with humility, that they have been trying to stand on water. And perhaps that is why the image remains so powerful. A ferry carries the body, but wisdom carries the heart. A boatman can guide one across a current, but no one else can release the clinging we protect as if it were identity. Teachers can point, companions can encourage, sacred words can console. Still, there comes a quiet moment when each person must feel the weight of what they are carrying and ask whether all of it must come along. Not everything does. Some burdens were never truly possessions, only fears repeated, so often they began to feel like truth. Some loyalties were really attachments to pain. Some identities were woven from comparison and defended out of exhaustion. Some grievances were kept alive long after they had ceased to protect anyone. To cross inwardly is not to become empty in a lifeless sense. It is to become less crowded, less pulled apart by old insistences, more able to meet the world without demanding that it confirm every hope and resist every change. This is why the Buddhist image of the farther shore can feel both distant and intimate. Distant, because the habits of grasping are ancient and stubborn. Intimate, because the crossing begins in the smallest possible place. This thought, this reaction, this breath in which one does not cling quite so fiercely. A great river may require a boat, a pole, a ferryman, and favorable conditions. But the movement from ignorance toward understanding can begin while standing still. It can begin while washing one's hands at the riverbank, while waiting for another passenger, while hearing an evening bird call over the water. The location may remain unchanged, while the heart shifts by a measure so fine that no one else could see it. Yet that shift may alter an entire life. How many people in the Buddha's time must have stood by the Ganges and felt, without language for it, that they were waiting for more than transport? They may have looked across to the opposite side and imagined trade, duty, reunion, or shelter, but beneath those practical hopes, some deeper intuition may have stirred. Not a thought exactly, more like a homesickness for peace. A sense that what was sought could not be purchased at market or inherited through family line. A feeling that one's true destination had something to do with laying down the war within the river, with its ceaseless passage, must have strengthened that intuition. Every crossing said, "You are not fixed where you began." Every current said, "Resistance is tiring." Every arrival said, "What seemed far can become near." And every return trip said something else just as important. No outer journey ends the inward work. One can cross and cross again, carrying the same attachments to different shores, until at last one understands that the final distance is measured not in miles but in relinquishment. Even so, there is nothing harsh in this realization. When held in the Buddha's light, it is not an accusation. It is a relief. If suffering were solved only by changing the world outside us, many would have no hope, for the world is unstable and often beyond our command. But if peace depends also on learning how to meet change without fastening the heart to what must pass, then a doorway opens even in difficult times. Not an easy doorway perhaps, but a real one. So the image remains. A person at the edge of the Ganges, looking outward and inward at once. Sand cool beneath the feet, the smell of wet earth rising softly, a ferryman calling for balance as the boat shifts from the bank. Above, a sky fading into evening blue, within some unnamed mixture of worry, memory, longing, and the wish to be free. The boat dip water winds, the near shore loosens behind, the far shore waits ahead. And somewhere deeper than both, the heart begins to understand that the most important landing place cannot be seen by the eyes. As the night deepens, memory itself begins to settle over the river, and the world of the Buddha grows softer and more dreamlike. As the night deepens, memory does not arrive all at once. It gathers quietly, like silver light spreading over moving water. The Ganges lies beneath the moon as though the sky itself has bent down to rest upon it. A long pale path trembles across the current, breaking and mending with every small ripple. Near the banks, the reeds sway in patient clusters, their thin bodies brushing one another, with a sound so soft, it seems less like noise than like breathing. Here and there, boats that worked through the day now drift in stillness, tied to posts or drawn halfway onto the sand, their wooden sides creaking gently as if settling into sleep. The air has changed. Day carried voices, bargaining, splashing, footsteps, the calls of boatmen, the laughter of children, the low murmur of prayer. But now these sounds have loosened and floated away. In their place comes a wider hush, a hush not empty but full. Somewhere far off, from a shrine hidden by darkness and trees, a bell sounds once. Then again the tone lingers over the water, thinning as it travels, until it becomes almost impossible to say whether it is still being heard or only remembered. Then even that fades, and the river resumes its ancient language. If you were lying there on the bank, close enough to smell damp grass and river mud, you might begin to feel that the night is listening as much as you are. The sand beneath you would hold the last coolness of evening. The earth would seem generous, firm, and old. Above, the moon would move slowly through a field of stars veiled now and then by thin clouds, and each passing veil would alter the river's face. In one moment the water would shine like polished metal. In the next, it would darken into velvet, deep and unknowable. Nothing would speak directly, and yet everything would seem to be saying something. This is how the historical world becomes tender at the edges. The names remain: kings, villages, merchants, monks, mothers, wanderers, ferrymen, teachers. The roads still lead between fields and groves. The monsoon still governs the moods of earth and river. Clay lamps still burn low before household shrines. But under moonlight, the sharp outlines soften. Time loosens its grip just enough for one century to lean close to another. You no longer feel as though you are only imagining a distant age. You feel that you have quietly entered it, or perhaps that it has made room for you beside it. The river holds more than reflections. It holds memory, not memory in a single mind, but memory spread through place, through repetition, through all that has been felt and spoken beside these waters. Countless conversations have vanished into this darkness, yet somehow they are not gone. A father teaching his son how to steady a boat against the current. Two sisters washing clothes and speaking in half whispers of marriage, fear, and leaving home. An old woman reciting a prayer she learned as a child, and now says without even thinking of the words. A traveler asking which road leads to Rajagaha. A laborer grieving in silence, because there is no one near enough to trust with his sorrow. A seeker speaking aloud, perhaps for the first time, the question that has followed him for years: is there any peace that does not break? The river has heard vows made in earnest, and vows made in desperation. Promises of kindness, promises of renunciation. Promises lovers believed would outlast all turning seasons. Promises spoken before journeys, before weddings, before births, before deaths. Some were kept, some dissolved by weakness, by circumstance, by forgetting. But the night does not judge what was fragile. It simply receives. It receives the trembling voice and the proud one, the truthful confession and the half-formed prayer, the brave resolve and the secret doubt. In that way, the Ganges becomes not only a witness to human life, but a companion to its incompleteness. How many tears have entered these waters? Tears of relief from those who reached the far bank after flood or storm. Tears of mourning when a pyre burned low and left only ash and smoke and the raw fact of absence. Tears of reunion when someone long gone returned at last by riverboat, thinner, older, but alive. Tears shed alone at dawn by those who could not explain their suffering even to themselves. Tears that fell from eyes closed in devotion. Tears hidden quickly, wiped away before anyone could see. The river has taken them all without distinction. Salt into sweetness, grief into motion, sorrow into the endless passing onward, and with tears came teachings. Not only formal teachings spoken by learned voices in monasteries or shaded groves, but teachings carried in fragments through ordinary speech. A mother telling a child, "Be gentle." A boatman warning, "Do not lean too far to one side." A farmer saying after a ruined crop, "We begin again." A widow speaking quietly to another widow about surviving one more season. And beyond all these, there were the teachings associated with the Blessed One, moving from village to village, from grove to gathering place, from attentive ears to uncertain hearts. Words about suffering, its causes, its ending, and the path. Words heard clearly by some, resisted by others, misunderstood by many, but preserved because something in them felt more solid than fear. Imagine those teachings arriving not as carved doctrine, but as living sound in the night world of the Ganges. A monk crossing by ferry after the day's discourse, still repeating a phrase inwardly so as not to lose it. A lay follower returning home with a strange lightness, unable yet to explain why a simple teaching on craving has made the whole evening seem different. A skeptical listener replaying each sentence, trying to find the flaw, and finding instead a quiet unease, as if the words had reached somewhere argument could not guard. Even silence, after teaching, has its own shape. People walk away changed in ways too small to notice at once. Yet the river notices, or if not notices, then receives the changing air around them. There were departures beside these banks that no one wished for. Sons leaving to seek work in another city, daughters carried away into new households, men joining caravans, uncertain of return, women standing with wrapped bundles and dry lips, choosing pilgrimage over familiarity, monastics stepping away from the home life into uncertainty, carrying little besides robe, bowl, and intention. The river watched them all move from known ground into open space. And there were returns as well. Sandaled feet on the same path months later. A voice recognized before the face could be seen. The lifting of a lamp, the pause before an embrace. The complicated joy of seeing what time has altered and what it has spared. All these layers seem to gather now in the moonlit dark, not crowded, not noisy, but suspended. The Ganges becomes like a vast breathing archive. Though no hand has written it down, the reeds whisper at the margins. Small fish break the surface and disappear. Somewhere a sleeping bird adjusts in its nest. A dog barks once in a distant settlement and is silent again. Between one sound and the next, a great tenderness opens. It is the tenderness of knowing that generation after generation has come here, carrying the same hidden weather of the heart. Hope, regret, desire, weariness, devotion, confusion, and that difficult, persistent longing for rest. Perhaps that is why the night feels so intimate. You are not standing outside the old world, studying it from a safe distance. You are lying near its pulse. The same moon that silvered these waters long ago still lays its soft path across them. The same human ache that stirred in ancient chests has not vanished from the earth. Different names, different garments, different duties, yes, but the inward movements remain recognizable. To wait, to remember, to fear loss, to love what passes, to search for something more lasting than pleasure and more trustworthy than mood. Under this sky, the distance between then and now grows thin enough to see through. The river seems almost to breathe beside you. A slow draw, a slow release. Water touches stone, withdraws, returns. The current keeps its own patient rhythm, too vast to hurry, too constant to stop. As you listen, your own breath may begin to follow it without effort. The body settles a little deeper. Thoughts still come, but they arrive less sharply, as though the night has wrapped their edges in cloth. One memory rises, then drifts away. Another follows. There is no need to hold them down and no need to chase them. The river has no need to cling to what passes over it. It receives, carries, lets go. In this softened world, even absence acquires a gentle form. The teachers who spoke are gone. The listeners who wept are gone. The hands that built the boats, lit the lamps, gathered the grain, folded in reverence, embraced in farewell, all gone, yet not entirely lost. Something remains, not as possession, but as resonance. The bank remembers pressure, the path remembers footsteps, the water remembers motion, and the heart, when it grows quiet enough, remembers truths it did not know it knew, that all things change, that clinging hurts, that kindness matters, that peace is not seized, but uncovered. You can almost sense how many people once looked upon this same ribbon of moonlight when they could not sleep. A young monk troubled by pride after praise from his companions, a mother waking to feed her child, and pausing at the doorway to look out toward the river, a merchant counting risks in his mind, a grieving brother asking why death comes where love has dwelled, a wandering ascetic uncertain whether to continue on the road or turn back. Each one held by the same night, each one hearing reeds move in the dark, each one, whether they knew it or not, being slowly instructed by the simple persistence of flowing water. For the river teaches without insisting. It does not argue, it does not flatter, it does not promise that sorrow can be avoided. It shows movement, it shows yielding without defeat, it shows depth hidden beneath shifting surfaces. It shows how the same water can reflect a star and carry away a broken branch. It shows how what appears dark may still be alive with motion. Those who lived in the Buddha's time would have known this not as metaphor first, but as daily presence. The river fed fields, bore travelers, swallowed carelessness, offered beauty, and reminded all who saw it that life is never fixed, no matter how fervently one might wish it to remain. So the night goes on, and the world grows quieter still. Temple bells no longer sound. The boats at rest drift only by inches against their ropes. The reeds continue their secret speech. Above, the moon climbs and the silver path shifts with it, as though inviting no one and everyone at once. You remain there at the edge of ancient water, included now in its long remembering, not separate from those who came before, but gently woven among them. Their longing touches yours, their weariness touches yours, their search for calm, for meaning, for release from the burning tangle of grasping and grief, touches yours too. And in this shared stillness, something subtle changes. The teachings no longer feel far away, no longer like words belonging only to monasteries, scriptures, or revered voices from another age. They begin to sound simpler, older, nearer, like the hush between bell tones, like the patient current moving under moonlight, like the reeds speaking to one another at the margin of sleep, as if the river has been saying them all along, not in sentences but in presence, not in command, but in invitation. Flow, release, return to stillness, listen closely enough, and what once seemed like distant philosophy becomes the most familiar sound in the night. And perhaps that is why the river feels so wise. It does not hurry to explain itself. It does not gather listeners and arrange its meaning into neat lines. It moves, and in moving reveals. It receives the mountain rains, the loosened earth, the fallen leaf, the small boat, the ashes of the dead, the laughter of children, the tears of mothers, the sandals of monks at the shore. It carries all of them without pride and without refusal. Day after day, season after season, it keeps going, And anyone who sits beside it long enough begins to understand something that no argument can fully contain. In the Buddha's time, many truths must have been learned this way, not only beneath groves where teachings were spoken aloud, not only in halls where questions were asked and answered, but also in the ordinary companionship of wind, dust, dusk, and water. A person might hear a discourse in the morning and still not understand it. Then, much later, while rinsing a bowl in the shallows, or waiting quietly for a ferry to arrive through the mist, the meaning might soften and open at last. Not because the words changed, but because life had made room for them, because repetition had polished the heart as water polishes stone. The river teaches first through impermanence. No surface remains as it was. Light touches it and moves on. Ripples rise and disappear. Reflections break apart the moment they seem whole. A branch drifts into view, circles once, and is gone. The bank itself slowly gives way in one place and gathers in another. Villages wake to a shoreline not quite the same as the one they knew before sleep. The water one sees at dawn is not the water one saw at midnight, and yet the river remains the river. Here is one of its tender paradoxes. Change does not destroy continuity. It is the very form continuity takes. How gently this might have entered the hearts of those who lived near it. A child grows tall. A father stoops. A season of plenty gives way to scarcity. Illness arrives where health once lived easily. Affection blossoms, then must endure separation. Faces once beloved become memory. Even joy cannot be held still. And because this is painful, the mind reaches out, trying to fasten itself to what is already moving away. But the river does not fasten. It offers another rhythm. See how the current touches and releases, touches and releases. See how it allows each leaf to pass. Not with coldness, but with complete participation in the law of passing things. This is not a lesson of despair, it is one of mercy. What changes also loosens. What arises can also fade. A troubled thought does not stay forever unless fed. A grief that seems heavier than the body can in time change shape. Anger flares and cools. Fear surges and ebbs. Even the self one guards so anxiously is less fixed than it appears. The river does not say, nothing matters, it says, everything moves. Therefore hold gently, love fully, but do not imprison. Care deeply, but do not demand that the world obey your longing for permanence. There is relief hidden in this, a deep exhale waiting beneath the struggle. And then there is interdependence, flowing everywhere through the life of the Ganges. No river exists by itself. It comes from rains no hand commands, from snow melting far away in the high silence of the mountains, from tributaries threading through forests, fields, villages, and unseen ground. It is fed by clouds shaped by slope widened by time. Birds depend on it. Fish depend on it. Farmers study it. Traders follow its course. Pilgrims seek its banks. Monasteries rise near its path. Rice because water arrives when it must. Clay softens. Nets fill. Lamps are floated upon its skin. Songs are carried over it at twilight. To watch such a river is to see that nothing truly stands alone. The meal in a bowl, the robe on a monk's shoulder, the raft crossing at dusk, the oil in a lamp, the child sleeping after a day in the fields, all are linked to countless conditions. So too with suffering, and so too with peace. A harsh word spoken in one house travels farther than the speaker knows. A kindness offered to a stranger ripples outward beyond all measure. A mind trained in patience steadies not only itself but others. A mind consumed by craving can unsettle a whole life. Then another still. The river's body is made of joining. Its wisdom is the same. Perhaps this is why humility rises so naturally beside moving water. No one can stand at the Ganges in flood and believe for long that human wishes are the center of the world. The current is older than one person's plans, wider than one person's grief, stronger than one person's certainty. It does not bend because someone insists. It does not pause for vanity. Kings may build steps down to the bank. Merchants may measure goods by the harbor. Ascetics may meditate in caves above the stream. Yet all of them, in one way or another, must learn to adjust themselves to what the river is doing. Water does not boast, but is non-con by noise. Humility in this sense is not humiliation. It is not the shrinking of the heart, it is the easing of the burden of self-importance. It is the recognition that one life, though precious, is not separate from the great unfolding of causes and conditions. To sit quietly by the river is to feel this in the body. Breathing becomes simpler, the restless urge to be exceptional softens. One begins to sense that peace may not come from winning every dispute within the mind, but from no longer making oneself the measure of all things. The river is free because it does not need to be admired. It fulfills its nature without announcement. And compassion, too, lives within the current's example. The Ganges receives everything that enters it. Clear streams, muddy runoff, petals from ceremonies, broken reeds, offerings, ashes, tears. It does not ask first whether what comes is worthy. It makes room. This does not mean it is harmed by nothing, nor that humans should not act with care, rather. The image itself suggests a heart capable of receiving experience without immediate rejection or hatred. A compassionate life does not sort the world too quickly into what deserves tenderness and what does not. It understands that suffering often arrives disguised as anger, confusion, silence, or clumsy action. Imagine those who came to hear the Buddha after walking long roads lined with dust. Some arrived grieving, some suspicious, some proud of their learning, some exhausted by labor, some frightened by illness or loss, some carrying private shame like a hidden stone. To such people, formal teaching mattered greatly. Words could point the way, loosen a knot, open a locked chamber of understanding. But perhaps just as powerful was the atmosphere in which they were received. The patience of listening, the refusal to turn away, the steady presence that did not harden in the face of another's pain. The river, in its own quiet manner, offers the same kind of embrace. Not sentimental, not dramatic, simply spacious. This is why silence becomes such an important teacher here. Not empty silence, not the tense silence of avoidance, but living silence, the kind that allows hidden things to rise gently into awareness. Beside the river, one hears more than water. One hears intervals, pauses, the space after a bird call, the soft collapse of a wave against mud, the long unspoken stretch in which the mind first fidgets, then settles, then notices what it was too hurried to notice before. In a world full of instruction, silence restores proportion. It reminds the listener that truth is not always seized, often it is received. Repetition deepens this receiving. The same shore at dawn, the same sound at night, the same current passing under changing skies. At first, repetition can seem uneventful to a mind addicted to novelty, but slowly it becomes intimate. What returns again and again wears a path into attention. A monk walking each morning to the water does not come to the same river as the one who comes only once. A woman washing cloth at the bank through many seasons begins to read subtleties invisible to others. A ferryman knows from tone and movement what weather is coming, where the depth has shifted, when caution is needed. Patient observation ripens into a kind of wisdom more faithful than quick opinion. So much of human confusion comes from wanting the answer before we have learned how to look. We wish to master in an instant what can only be understood through staying. Yet the deepest teachings often ask for just this: remain, attend, soften, return. Not forever lost in analysis, not endlessly debating the shape of truth while never tasting it, but quietly inhabiting the conditions in which truth becomes evident. In the Buddha's age, as now, there were surely many who loved to argue. Concepts have their place. Careful discernment matters. But there are moments when 1,000 clever distinctions cannot do what 1 hour of honest stillness can. The river does not defeat thought. It puts thought back into balance. It shows the mind its own movement. Watch the current. and one sees how ideas rush, collide, divide, and disappear. Some thoughts cling like eddies near the bank. Others flash and vanish before they can be named. If one sits without forcing, a subtle trust begins to grow. Not every thought needs to be followed. Not every feeling requires a verdict. Not every uncertainty must be solved before peace is possible. The river keeps moving whether the mind comments on it or not. There is comfort in this. Existence is not waiting for perfect understanding before it continues. And perhaps that is one of the quietest forms of wisdom the Ganges offered those who lived along it during the Buddha's lifetime. That awakening was not only a matter of hearing sublime truths, but of learning how to live close enough to reality that the truths became visible in daily experience, in the lifting of a water jar, in the watching of silts settle, in the care taken not to waste what was needed by others downstream, in the recognition that one's own body, like the riverbank, is shaped by countless forces and cannot be possessed forever, in the discovery that gentleness is not weakness, but alignment with how life actually unfolds. Those who listened deeply may have found that the world itself became less mute, not because trees and currents began speaking in magical words, but because attention became more tender, more precise, more willing to learn. Then everything ordinary began to glow with instruction, a reed bending rather than breaking, foam gathering briefly around a stone, then vanishing, footprints at the edge of the water, erased by morning, a boatman waiting for the fog to lift instead of cursing it, a widow sitting quietly after weeping, her breath slowly lengthening with the night breeze. Each moment carried something of the Dharma, not as doctrine imposed upon life, but as life revealing its own lawful texture. To live this way is to be taught without being scolded, guided without being cornered, corrected without humiliation. The river does not shame human sorrow. It simply places sorrow within a large emotion. It does not deny individuality. It cradles individuality inside relationship. It does not abolish longing. It softens longing's fever, and because of this, the heart can rest while still learning. That may be why the memory of such places lingers so strongly across centuries. Not only because important figures once walked there, but because the conditions of seeing were so present. Stillness, repetition, humility, dependence, release. As the night deepens around this ancient river, all these lessons seem to gather without crowding one another. Impermanence moving like silver across the dark water. Interdependence resting in every hidden stream that feeds the whole. Humility as wide as the open bank beneath the sky. Compassion as quiet as the current that makes room for all it carries. None of it forced, none of it announced, just there as it always was, waiting for a mind gentle enough to notice. And from here the journey begins to lean toward rest. The banks grow dimmer. The voices of the day have thinned into distance. Above, the stars appear one by one, as if the heavens themselves were listening. Below, the river continues its patient passage, bearing the last light, the last murmurs, the last unspoken understandings into the shelter of night, as though it too were preparing to lay down its final thoughts beneath the stars. Now, in this gentler hour, there is no need to follow every footstep or remember every name. The story can soften around the edges, the way the riverbank softens when night mist settles over it. What was once clear in the brightness of day becomes tender in the dark, not lost, only quieter. And perhaps this is the kindest way to hold what we have seen together along the Ganges in the time of the Buddha, not as a collection of hard details to keep in the mind, but as living impressions that can rest in the heart. You may begin to feel the images returning, not sharply, but like reflections drifting across still water. Dawn mist hovering low over the river, pale and cool, before the first voices of morning have fully awakened the shore. A ferry moving carefully across the current, wood creaking softly, passengers wrapped in shawls or silence, each one carrying some private destination, some errand of love, duty, grief, trade, devotion, or simple necessity. Monks chanting in the early light, their voices steady and unadorned, entering the air as naturally as birdsong. Village fires breathing out thin ribbons of smoke into the sky at dusk while hands prepare rice, mend baskets, soothe crying children, or pause for one small moment of rest. Moonlight pouring over the river at night until the water seems no longer made of movement but of silver breath, and all around, listening hearts. Not perfect hearts, not fearless hearts, only human hearts, pausing long enough to hear something true. As these images return, they do not ask anything difficult of you. They do not demand that you solve their meaning tonight. They come the way old friends sometimes come in memory, sitting beside you, without urgency. The mist, the crossing, the chant, the firelight, the moonlit current, all of them seem to gather near, not to impress you, but to accompany you into stillness. It is enough simply to notice them, enough to feel how gently they move through the mind when nothing is grasped too tightly. And perhaps one of the quietest comforts in this journey is the realization that the people who lived beside this river so long ago were never made of legend alone. They were not carved from distance. They were not untouched by uncertainty. They worried over illness. They wondered whether loved ones would return safely. They carried weariness in their limbs after long days of labor. They knew the ache of being misunderstood, the fear of losing what they loved, the hunger for peace, the pull of habit, the sting of regret, the brief sweetness of laughter shared at the end of the day. They watched children grow. They buried their dead. They hoped for rain. They looked into darkness and asked the same silent questions that still visit human hearts. Now this matters, because it means we do not stand outside their world as strangers peering in. We meet them in the most intimate way possible, through our shared vulnerability. The mother waiting by a doorway for someone overdue, the old farmer reading the clouds with concern, the young novice trying to steady his restless thoughts, the boatman who has crossed this river 1,000 times and still cannot command the current, the merchant counting coins while wondering why gain never fully stills the mind, the grieving friend who listens for wisdom but can only hear the echo of absence. These were not symbolic figures moving through an unreal age. They were people as tender and unfinished as we are, and so the river becomes even more consoling, because it flowed past all of them, just as time flows past us. It did not pause to separate the noble from the ordinary, the learned from the simple, the joyful from the sorrowing. It carried light and shadow together. It received prayers, ashes, flower petals, tears, laughter, offerings, footsteps, and silence. It reflected the faces of those who came to it with faith, and those who came only because life required another crossing before sunset. The Ganges did what rivers do. It remained in motion, it received, it released, it continued. There is something deeply restful in that. We spend so much of life imagining that peace will come only after every confusion has been clarified, every wound repaired, every fear answered. But the river does not wait for completion before it flows. It moves through muddy water and clear water alike. It passes crowded ghats and empty banks. It shines under morning gold and under storm-dark skies. In the same way, your life does not need to become perfectly arranged before you are allowed a moment of gentleness. Your heart does not need to solve itself tonight. You can simply witness this breath arriving, this thought passing, this memory loosening, this ache softening by one small degree. You can let your inner world be what the river has always been, a place where currents move, where eddies form and disappear, where things once clutched begin to drift free when held with kindness instead of force. To witness is not to withdraw from life. It is to stop fighting every movement within it. It is to sit on the quiet bank and watch without condemning the water for being water. If you listen carefully, You may sense how the whole story has been guiding you here, not only through teachings, places, or history, but through mood, through rhythm, through the patient return of simple images. Dawn mist that asked you to begin softly, ferries that reminded you that every being is in passage, chants that showed how a human voice can carry calm without needing grandeur, village fires that kept faith with ordinary tenderness, with the sacred hidden inside the evening meal and the worn routine of care, moonlit water that made no argument and yet said everything about transience, about beauty that appears and vanishes while remaining beautiful still, and listening hearts, always listening hearts, because the deepest understanding was never in the noise of possession, but in the humility of attention. Perhaps tonight you can feel yourself among them, not as an observer standing apart from the banks of the ancient Ganges, but as one more traveler who has come near the water at the end of a long day. Maybe you have brought questions. Maybe you have brought tiredness. Maybe there are burdens you have been carrying for so long that they have begun to feel like part of your body, responsibilities, old griefs, quiet disappointments, worries you revisit in the dark, words you wish you had said differently, things you cannot repair by thinking them over one more time. Here, beside this inward river, nothing asks you to deny those burdens. But perhaps, just for now, you do not need to hold them with such effort. Imagine placing them down beside you on the earth, not throwing them away, not pretending they never mattered, simply setting them down, one by one, as a traveler sets down a heavy bundle after many miles. Feel the relief of not gripping so tightly. Feel the ground receive what you have carried. The quiet bank does not judge the weight of your load. It has known countless travelers before you. It knows that every life gathers dust, strain, memory, longing. It knows that even a strong heart grows tired. You are allowed to rest. In this resting, the past and present seem to touch each other very gently. Somewhere in the distance of imagination, a ferry reaches the opposite shore. Somewhere a monk's chant fades into the cool air before dawn. Somewhere a mother leans over a sleeping child, while embers glow low in the village hearth. Somewhere moonlight opens a silver path over dark water, and someone who cannot sleep lifts their eyes and feels less alone. These scenes belong to another age, and yet they do not feel entirely gone. Human tenderness keeps them near. Human longing keeps them understandable. Human awareness keeps them alive. And if the Buddha's time still speaks to us, perhaps it is because it was never merely about the past. It was about the timeless fact of being human in a changing world, to love what cannot be kept forever, to fear what has not yet happened, to chase certainty and find only another question, to pause at last and discover that peace begins not with control, but with clear and compassionate seeing. The people by the Ganges learned this slowly, as we do, not all at once, not without stumbling, not without tears, but they learned that even in a life touched by loss, there could be dignity. Even in uncertainty, there could be steadiness. Even in sorrow, there could be kindness. Even while the river moved on, there could be a way to sit beside it and not be swept away by every thought. So let the story become spacious now. Let it untie itself from sequence and settle into feeling. You do not need to remember what came first or what came after. You only need the atmosphere of it. Cool mist on the skin, sandalwood or smoke in the air, the muted splash of oars, robes stirring in the dawn breeze, evening fires blink across the shore like patient stars, moonlight laying a tender road over the current. You need only the sense that many lives once unfolded here, each carrying hidden struggles and hidden hopes, each seeking some measure of safety, meaning, love, or release. And you need only the quiet understanding that your own life belongs to the same great human stream. If there is sorrow in that, there is also comfort. You are not alone in your restlessness. You are not alone in your tenderness. You are not alone in your unfinishedness. Across centuries, Countless hearts have known what it is to tremble, to hope, to wait, to regret, to begin again. Countless hearts have stood at the edge of flowing water and felt, if only for a moment, that life did not need to be conquered to be met wisely. Sometimes it was enough to breathe, enough to listen, enough to loosen the hand around what could not remain, enough to bless what was here while it was here. And maybe that is where stillness truly begins, not in making the mind empty by force, but in allowing experience to be held in a softer way, a softer gaze, a softer breath, a softer grip around the stories you tell yourself about what should already be fixed. Like the Ganges under moonlight, your inner life can continue moving without becoming a threat. Thoughts may pass, feelings may rise and sink, memories may shimmer and fade, but beneath all of that, there can be a wider quiet that does not panic, a quiet that knows movement is not the enemy, a quiet that trusts the current enough to stop thrashing against it. So if there is anything in you tonight that feels overburdened, let it lean closer to this ancient river. If there is anything in you that feels ashamed of its own tiredness, let it be met by the simple humanity of those who came before, those monks, ferrymen, mothers, laborers, elders, children, seekers, doubters and listeners, who also grew weary beneath the turning sky. If there is anything in you that still believes peace must be earned through perfect understanding, let the water teach otherwise. It is enough to arrive, enough to sit, enough to be carried for a little while by a gentler way of seeing. The night has grown deep now, and the story itself seems to breathe more slowly. The banks are dim, the fires low, the voices nearly gone. Yet nothing essential has disappeared. The river is still here. The listening is still here. The quiet wisdom gathered along these shores is still here, not pressing upon you, only surrounding you like cool darkness and distant water. You have followed this current far enough for tonight. You have looked into its reflections. You have walked beside lives both ancient and familiar. And now perhaps you can allow your own heart to become one more quiet shore, where all that has been seen may gently settle. And at last, with the current moving steadily through the dark, the story reaches its final place of blessing and farewell. The water keeps moving, and in its quiet passage, the night finally lets the heart sleep. Far out in the darkness, the Ganges still travels by moonlight, though no one stands upon every bank to witness it. It slips past sleeping villages, past moored boats that rock only slightly in the current, past reeds that bend and rise again with hardly a sound. The sandbars pale under the sky. The old paths descending to the water lie empty now. Clay jars have been carried home. Lamps have burned low. Footsteps have faded. Even the last murmurs of conversation have thinned into silence. And still the river goes on, not waiting for praise, not grieving the absence of those who once looked upon it, simply moving with the same patient faithfulness with which it moved before dawn, at midday, at dusk, and long before any of these names were given to ours. In the time of the Buddha, it must have been like this on many nights. After the teachings were spoken, and the travelers had settled themselves beneath trees or beneath rough woven coverings, after merchants had tied their bundles, after children had fallen asleep against their mothers, after monks had folded their robes and entered stillness, the river would remain awake in its own way, not restless, not troubled, only present, a long shining body under the stars, carrying coolness, reflection, silt, memory and the faint sounds of life without ever trying to hold any one thing forever. This may be one of the river's quietest teachings. Everything comes near it for a while. A hand dips into it, a ferry cuts across it, a prayer is whispered beside it, ashes are scattered over it, a child laughs near it, a grieving person kneels beside it, a king may command near it, a renunciant may meditate beside it. Birds cross its surface in the first pale light, rain enters it, leaves drift into it, and yet the river does not cling to what touches it. It receives, and it continues, it reflects, And it continues. It nourishes. So too, with the world the Buddha walked through. There were cities and forests, arguments and reconciliations, hunger and generosity, illness and healing, longing and release. There were countless names, countless faces, countless moments of tenderness and fear. The Buddha spoke among all of this, not outside it. He did not ask the world to stop changing before wisdom could be found. He did not ask sorrow to vanish before compassion could begin. He looked directly at the fragile nature of life, and in doing so, revealed something spacious enough to hold even that fragility without despair. Perhaps that is why this night feels so gentle now. Not because all suffering has been erased, not because every question has been answered, but because something in you may be settling beside the truth that change is not a mistake in the fabric of things. It is the fabric of things. The river moves because water moves. Clouds pass because clouds pass. Bodies grow, tire, heal, weaken, and rest. Voices rise and disappear because they are voices. Even joy, precious as it is, cannot be forced to stay unchanged. Even grief, heavy as it feels, cannot remain in one fixed shape forever. The heart suffers most when it tries to build a permanent house in what was only ever passing through. A thought arrives and says, this must remain. A feeling arrives and says, this must never leave. A fear arrives and says, this will never end. But the night around the Ganges suggests another possibility. Let the current be current. Let the passing be passing. Let the mind loosen its tight fist around what cannot be kept. In that loosening, something softer appears. Not indifference, not withdrawal, something kinder than that. A way of being present without trying to imprison the world. The Buddha's compassion was shaped in this same world of changing forms. He saw aging, he saw sickness, he saw death. He saw confusion in the mind and craving in the heart. Yet he did not turn cold. He did not harden himself against the sorrow of beings. Instead, understanding deepened tenderness. Seeing clearly did not make love disappear. It purified it. It made compassion less possessive, less frightened, less tangled in demand. It became like water offered to the thirsty, like shade offered at noon, like a hand extended, not to control another life, but to lessen suffering where one can. As you rest here now, listening in the late hour, perhaps you can feel how relieving that is. You do not have to solve all of life tonight. You do not have to untie every knot in memory. You do not have to force yourself into peace by effort alone. There is another kind of peace, one that begins when you stop arguing with the basic movement of things. Breath comes, breath goes, thoughts gather, thoughts fade. The body grows heavier with rest, the night deepens. Somewhere, in the imagination of this ancient world, the Ganges continues its dark, shining journey, and your listening joins it for a little while. If there is an inner refuge, it may not be a place where nothing changes. It may be the quiet knowing that can remain gentle, even as everything changes. It may be the awareness that notices sorrow, without becoming only sorrow. It may be the small, clear space in which anger is seen before it becomes action, in which fear is felt without becoming the whole sky, in which tenderness can survive disappointment. This refuge is not far away. It does not depend on owning the right object or arranging the world into obedience. It begins in this simple intimacy with what is here, this moment, as it is. The monks of the Buddha's time sought forests, groves, and riverbanks not because nature erased the mind, but because it revealed the mind more honestly. In the presence of running water, one could sense directly that no state lasts. In the presence of vast sky, one could sense that thoughts are small weather, not the whole of reality. In the hush before dawn, or the stillness after moonrise, one could sense how much suffering comes from insisting that the flowing should become fixed. Maybe that is why this river has stayed with us, through the long arc of the night. It is landscape, yes, but it is also mirror. It shows us the tenderness of impermanence without needing to say a word. And how many lives has it outlasted? How many plans, quarrels, ceremonies, reunions, departures? How many promises spoken sincerely at the edge of the water? How many tears dropped unnoticed into its current? The river keeps none of these in the way the human mind keeps them. It does not turn memory into burden. It does not recite old injuries back to itself. And still, in another sense, it holds everything, not by grasping, by having received, by having witnessed, by having touched and been touched in that way. It carries the Buddha's world too, not as a museum carries relics, sealed and unmoving, but as living water carries moonlight, always changing and yet still luminous. There is comfort in that. The past need not be frozen to remain meaningful. What was holy does not vanish simply because time has passed. The footsteps of the Buddha are no longer fresh upon the earth. The spoken words no longer travel on the original air. The listeners who once sat near him have long since entered silence. Yet the truths they encountered remain available wherever a mind grows still enough to recognize them. Impermanence still speaks. Compassion still speaks. Letting go still speaks. The possibility of waking up from confusion into clarity still speaks. Tonight it speaks gently. So, if there is anything left to do, perhaps it is only this. Allow yourself to be held by what does not need force. Let the jaw soften. Let the tongue rest. Let the eyes remain closed if they wish. Let the shoulders drop their long, invisible labor. Let the chest be wide enough for one more breath, and then another. If a thought comes, let it come like a boat moving through fog. If a memory rises, let it rise like moonlight touching water and then breaking apart. If sleep approaches, welcome it without ceremony. Nothing more is required of you. The river does not demand wakefulness from every shore. It flows beside sleepers, as faithfully as it flows beside watchers. It asks no one to prove worthiness. It does not divide the night into the successful and the unsuccessful. It simply continues. And in that continuance, there is a blessing. You may rest without finishing everything. You may pause without losing your way. You may be unfinished and still be embraced by the great tenderness of being alive for this one brief, changing human life. And perhaps that is one final gift from the Buddha's time, carried to us through image, story, and silence. Awakening was never meant to belong only to the extraordinary. The path begins in ordinary seeing, this breath, this body, this ache, this kindness, this moment of not turning away. The sacred is not elsewhere. It is hidden in the way attention softens, in the way the heart ceases for a moment to clutch and defend, in the way compassion appears even in weariness, in the way the mind learns to sit beside reality without demanding another version of it. Now the banks feel very far and very near at once. The whole night seems gathered into one slow, cool breath. The stars above the river do not need names. The current below them does not need to announce where it is going. The teachings do not need to become loud in order to be true. And you do not need to do anything remarkable to belong to this peace. You are already here. The listening is already here. The stillness has already begun to make room for you. As every human voice falls quiet, the Ganges continues. It moves beyond the last fire, beyond the last remembered conversation, beyond the places where history can still clearly say who stood where and when. It moves through darkness without fear. It moves under constellations that have watched generations arrive and disappear. It moves through the same wide law that holds all things. Arising, passing, changing, returning in forms no one can fully command. And somehow this is not a lonely truth, it is a tender one. Because if all things change, then pain changes too. If all things pass, then clinging can loosen. If nothing can be held forever, then each moment of kindness, carry that gently now, not as a task but as a warmth. Change is not your enemy. Compassion is not weakness. Inner refuge is not escape. These are quiet truths, but they are strong enough to accompany a life. They are strong enough to soften fear, strong enough to make the world a little less sharp. strong enough to remain, even after the story ends and sleep takes you farther than words can go. So let the river flow on. Let the Buddha's world recede into the dark without disappearing. Let the night close around every path, every tree, every silent monastery wall, every resting animal, every drifting cloud, every memory we have touched together. And let your own heart become simple now, like a calm bank under moonlight, asking for nothing, resisting nothing, held by the quiet movement of what is. Here, at the edge of the final hush, there is no need to separate the river from the listening, or the listening from the teachings, or the teachings from the soft breathing of the one who hears them. Everything has grown spacious enough to rest together. The water, the darkness, the ancient world, the weary mind, the tender heart, nothing grasped, nothing pushed away, only this shared stillness flowing and resting at once. May you sleep with that feeling. May you drift without fear. May you trust the gentle current beneath thought, beneath memory, beneath the effort of being someone for a little while longer. The river continues through the night, and in its quiet, enduring passage, there is room for your whole life to soften, end in a calm, spacious reflection where the river, the listener, and the Buddha's teaching seem to rest inside the same quiet flow. If you find this useful, subscribe to the channel, like this, leave a comment.